She was rejected in front of 10,000 witnesses. Not quietly, not privately. The man destined to be hers by blood and bone turned his back on her like she was nothing, like the pull between them was a mistake worth correcting in public. And here's what nobody tells you about an alpha who gets discarded. She doesn't break. She transforms. What they threw away becomes the very weapon that dismantles them. Stay until the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from because this one's going to hit different, depending on how much you've ever had to rebuild yourself from zero. The Hall of 1,000 Fires burned bright enough to make the night jealous. That was what they called it. The great ceremonial chamber at the heart of Kaelor Palace, where every stone in the vaulted ceiling had been carved by the first emperor's hands, and every iron sconce held a torch that had never once gone cold in 400 years of empire. The smoke from those torches curled upward into darkness like prayers that had stopped believing in themselves. Alira Voss stood near the eastern colonnade, third row back from the bonding floor, and breathed through her mouth because the hall smelled of perfume, ambition, and the particular anxiety that comes from 300 noble houses pretending not to compete. She did not want to be here. That was the first truth of the evening, plain and unglamorous. She had worn her formal archivist gray, not the silver-threaded court gowns the noble daughters displayed like armor, because she had been assigned attendance as a matter of record-keeping. Someone had to document the bonding. Someone always did. The empire ran on documentation, on the transcription of power into language, the language into law, the law into leash. Alira understood that relationship better than most people understood their own names. She had spent 6 years in the Imperial Records Hall reducing dynasties to filing categories. Her hair was pulled back with a bone pin. Her ink-stained fingers were hidden in her sleeves. She held a leather-bound journal against her ribs, the way other women held their children, instinctively, a little desperately. The drums began, 3 slow beats that vibrated through the floor and up through the soles of her boots and into the bones of her legs. Every conversation in the hall died like a candle in wind. The nobles straightened. The military commanders squared their shoulders. The 12 High Lords of Valdrake turned their faces toward the far archway with expressions that had been rehearsed for exactly this moment. And then Emperor Draven Kaelor walked into the light. Alira had seen him before. Everyone in the palace had seen him before. He was not a man who occupied rooms quietly. He stood at 6'4" with the kind of build that suggested he had earned every inch of it through something worse than exercise, through actual war, actual pain, actual killing, when killing was the only honest answer a situation had left. His dark hair was cut short on the sides and longer on top, swept back without ceremony. The imperial uniform, black, silver-threaded at the collar, the Kaelor dragon embossed on the left breast, fit him the way armor fits a man who has worn it so long he no longer notices the weight. His eyes were gray, not soft gray, not romantic gray. Gray the way winter sky is gray when snow is coming and you have nowhere to go indoors. He walked the bonding floor alone, as tradition demanded. No escort, no entourage. The Alpha Emperor of Valdrake presenting himself to the ancient ritual in solitude, because the old ways required that the bond be genuine, that it find its own path without manipulation or arrangement. That was the story the Empire told itself anyway, that the night of bonding was sacred, honest, beyond the reach of politics. Alira wrote the date in the top margin of her journal page. She did not look up from her writing when the drums stopped. That was when it happened. She would spend years trying to reconstruct the exact mechanism of it, the neurological event, or the bloodline resonance, or whatever clinical vocabulary could contain what was actually an earthquake contained entirely inside her chest. One moment she was pressing ink into paper, noting the atmospheric conditions and the attendance count, doing her job with the quiet efficiency that had kept her invisible and therefore safe for 6 years. The next moment, something inside her recognized something across the room. Not saw, not heard, recognized. Like a word in a language you forgot you knew. Like the particular weight of a hand that held yours once, years ago, in a moment you'd filed under survivable loss and tried not to revisit. Her pen stopped moving. She looked up, and Emperor Draven Kaelor was looking directly at her. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet. Through 3 rows of nobles and 2 columns of ceremonial guard, and all the smoke and candlelight and competing perfumes of the Empire's finest bloodlines, His gray eyes had found her gray eyes, and for exactly 3 seconds, which felt architecturally identical to 3 years, neither of them moved. The pull was not metaphor. This is important. This is the thing that people who have not experienced it cannot be expected to understand, and the thing that those who have experienced it can never fully explain without sounding like they've lost their minds. The pull was a physical sensation, measurable in pressure and heat, and the sudden cellular certainty that the space between two bodies is a mistake that physics is trying to correct. It began in the sternum and radiated outward through the ribs and down through the belly, and it was not comfortable. It was not soft. It felt, if anything, like being told a truth you had successfully avoided for your entire life. Mate. The word arrived in her mind without her permission. She did not say it aloud. She did not have to. Around them, and she became aware of this slowly, like a person surfacing from deep water. The hall had changed. A handful of court sensitives near the bonding floor had gone very still. One of the high lords had turned to look at her with an expression she could not yet read. The air itself seemed to have shifted pressure. Draven's expression remained controlled. That was the word. Controlled. Not cold, not empty, not the face of a man who felt nothing. The face of a man who felt everything and had spent so long deciding that feelings were tactical information to be managed rather than experienced, that the machinery of control had become indistinguishable from the man himself. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. He turned toward the bonding floor and toward the woman who had already been positioned there. Duchess Veressa Thorne of the House Thorne, military dynasty, controller of the eastern trade routes, commander of the Thornwall garrison that kept the Empire's most contested border viable. She was extraordinary in the way that useful things are extraordinary. Beautiful in the deliberate architectural way of someone who understood that appearance was a weapon and had sharpened it accordingly. She stood on the bonding floor in silver and white, with her auburn hair pinned in imperial style, and her chin lifted at the precise angle that said, "I belong here to anyone who cared to read posture as language." Draven walked to her. He took her hand. He spoke the bonding words. The hall erupted. The drums returned, all of them this time, the full ceremonial array, a sound like the sky deciding to be loud. Nobles applauded. The 12 high lords began the ritual affirmation. Goblets were raised. Somewhere near the front, a woman's voice cried out in joy. The Empire celebrated its emperor's perfect, strategic, absolutely correct decision with the enthusiasm of a people who had been taught that correctness and power were the same word. Elira stood in the eastern colonnade with her journal pressed against her ribs. Her pen had left a long, unintentional line across the page where her hand had stopped. She looked at that line for a moment. Then she closed the journal. She did not cry. She would want to be very clear about that later, in the parts of her mind she still held honestly. She did not cry, and she did not make a sound, and she did not do any of the things that the situation could have reasonably demanded from a person of normal emotional architecture. She stood very still while the celebration built around her like a tide that had decided she was furniture, and she felt the humiliation. Not as a wave, not as a flood, but as a slow-burning thing, like iron heating in a forge, the kind of heat that has patience. She thought very clearly. He saw me. Then, he chose anyway. Then, and this was the one that would matter, the one that would follow her across borders and through ruins and into a darkness she couldn't yet name. He chose to. There is a significant difference between a man who turns away because he does not see you and a man who turns away because he sees you perfectly and decides you are not worth the cost of choosing. The first is tragedy. The second is a kind of violence that leaves no visible mark. She turned and walked toward the eastern exit. Nobody noticed. That was the Empire's first mistake. She made it to the corridor outside before her legs stopped cooperating entirely. She put one hand against the stone wall. Cold, old, solid in the way that things built by conquerors are solid, built to last and to remind you that it will last long after you don't. And she breathed, in, out. The sounds of celebration filtered through the archway behind her, muffled but persistent. She breathed, in, out. You felt it too. The voice came from her left, low and careful, the voice of someone who had learned to speak quietly in halls where sound traveled unpredictably. She turned. A woman stood in the corridor shadow, one of the court sensitives, a title that meant something between advisor and archivist, and the kind of person who tracked bloodline resonances for the imperial record. She was older, maybe 60, with the particular stillness of someone who had watched empires do what empires do and arrived at a kind of permanent calm about it. "I don't know what you mean," Alira said. "Yes, you do." The woman stepped closer. Her eyes were very dark and very direct. "I've been doing this work for 31 years. I know what a bond recognition looks like from 20 yards. I also know what it looks like when an emperor decides not to act on one." She paused. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." The words came out harder than Alira intended. "It's not your fault." "No, but someone should say it." Alira looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to an unacknowledged bond?" The sensitive's expression did something complicated. "Officially, the records will reflect that no bond occurred tonight, that the emperor selected his mate through personal and political wisdom, as is his right." She hesitated. "Unofficially. Unofficially. It doesn't disappear. It changes." She seemed to choose her next words with the care of someone diffusing something. For the rejected party, in particular, suppressed bonds have a history of becoming something else entirely, something the original parties wouldn't necessarily recognize. Alira said nothing. The sensitive looked at her for another moment, then said, "Leave the palace tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." "I'm assigned to leave," the woman said, and the single word carried the full weight of 31 years of watching what happened to people who didn't. "Whatever you are, whatever your blood carries, this palace is the wrong place for it now. They will study you, contain you, or worse, they'll try to pretend you don't exist. And trust me, that last option is the cruelest one of all." She turned and walked back the way she'd come without another word. Alira stood in the corridor alone. The celebration continued behind her. She thought about her desk in the records hall, the filing system she had built over 6 years, the index of forgotten bloodlines she had been compiling for the past 8 months, a labor of genuine passion in a life otherwise structured around survival. The small room in the servants' quarters with the window that faced east and caught the morning light at the exact right angle to read without eye strain. She thought about all of it. Then she went to pack. She took 3 things: the journal, a small knife she'd carried since she was 12, and the book she'd been working from, an ancient text in a cipher she'd almost cracked, written in a dialect older than the empire itself. She'd told herself for months that she was keeping it only for professional interest. She understood now that she had been keeping it because some part of her had always known. She left before the 4th hour of the ceremony. The palace gate guards were watching the wrong direction. By the time the drums finally silenced and the emperor escorted his newly claimed mate through the Hall of 1,000 Fires to the imperial chambers, Alira Voss was already beyond the outer walls. The knight received her without ceremony. That was fine. She had never needed ceremony. She had needed truth, and she had just received a very particular version of it, written in the language of a man who chose correctly by every measure the empire used to define correctness, and she intended to spend however long it took becoming conversant in a different language entirely. The road east out of the capital stretched toward darkness and mountains, and everything the empire had decided it did not need to know about. She walked. She did not look back, not because the city behind her didn't matter, not because she felt nothing, but because she had made a decision somewhere between the corridor wall and the packing of her bag, a decision so clean and precise that it felt less like an emotion and more like a revision of a foundational document. She was no longer the woman who could be left behind. She was the woman who was leaving. That distinction, small as it appeared in the moment, was the first brick of everything that came after. The Ashen territories began where the empire decided to stop maintaining the road. That was the most honest description. Not a natural border, not a geographical boundary of significance, just the point at which Valdrake's engineers had looked at the terrain ahead, the jagged mountains, the dead forest, the soil that had once been volcanic and still occasionally reminded you of that, and decided the infrastructure cost outweighed the military value. The empire drew its edge there and called everything beyond it abandoned. The things that lived in the abandoned territories had their own word for where they lived: home. Alira crossed the boundary on the 3rd day when her feet had stopped hurting badly enough to notice, and had moved into the deeper register of pain that the body stops reporting because it has recalibrated its idea of normal. She had eaten dried provisions from her pack. She had slept twice against tree roots. She had cried exactly once, for approximately 7 minutes, somewhere in the dark of the second night, with her face pressed into her sleeves so the sound wouldn't carry. Then she had assembled herself back into functional order and kept walking. She was thinking about the ciphertext when she heard the voice behind her. "You're moving like someone who knows where she's going." She did not spin. She turned deliberately, with the knife already open in her hand, held low and honest where anyone could see it. 3 people stood 20 yards back on the road. 1 woman, 2 men. Not soldiers. Their posture was wrong for soldiers, too loose, too comfortable in the terrain. The woman in front was perhaps 40, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had been through weather in ways that had improved it. Her eyes went directly to the knife. "Good," the woman said, with what appeared to be genuine approval. "Soft hands, but not soft instincts. That's an interesting combination." "Who are you?" Elira said. "Mira. These 2 are Corvin and Bale." She said the names the way you introduce furniture. "Here, this exists. Note it. We've been following you since you crossed the boundary marker." "Reason?" "You crossed it alone, on foot, in archivist gray, with a very old book and a practical knife and no visible panic. People who cross that boundary in that condition are either very stupid or very interesting. You don't read stupid." Elira regarded them. Her hand stayed exactly where it was. "What do you want?" "To ask you something first." Mira tilted her head. "The ciphertext. You've been working it while you walk. I can see the pages from here. You're reading the Nocthir Old Tongue." A pause. "Are you?" The word landed somewhere in Elira's chest with the particular weight of confirmation. Nocthir. She had encountered that word only once in 6 years of archival work, in a document that had been so thoroughly expunged from the imperial record that only its reference number survived, catalogued under the heading Historical Deletions, sensitive with no further notation. She had noted it, filed the absence where the document had been, and gone back to her work. She had not forgotten it. "Where did you hear that word?" she said. "From the people who taught us to say it." Mira looked at her with an expression that was direct without being threatening. "The same people who have been waiting 23 years for the woman who was hidden inside Valdrake's palace records to figure out she needed to leave." The silence on the road was absolute. Elira breathed. "You knew about me," she said. "We knew what you are." Mira's voice was careful. "Not you specifically. Not your name or your face. We knew that someone carrying dormant sovereign blood had been placed inside Valdrake as a survival measure during the erasure. We have been watching the palace record staff for 2 decades. She paused. "You were the only one who understood the ciphertext." Elira's knife hand did not waver. "What's the erasure?" "The thing the Empire calls imperial consolidation, the thing that actually happened." Mira glanced at the 2 men, then back. "We can explain everything, but not on the road. There are things out here that have learned to recognize sovereign blood by instinct, and not all of them are friendly." "Are you?" Mira considered this with what seemed like genuine honesty. "We are aligned with your survival. Whether that makes us friendly depends on what happens next." She extended one hand, palm up, empty. "Come with us. Hear what we know. Then decide." Elira looked at the hand. She thought about the Hall of 1,000 Fires. She thought about gray eyes that had found her across 40 feet of smoke and candlelight, and then made a decision. She thought about what the sensitive had said. "Whatever you are, whatever your blood carries." She closed the knife. She did not take Mira's hand. She walked past her toward the mountain path, and she said, "Then lead." The fortress was 3 hours' climb into the mountains, hidden by geography and by something else. Something Elira felt as a subtle wrongness in perception, a slight consistent disorientation that resolved the moment Mira spoke a single word she didn't recognize, and the path ahead became clear. A ward. Ancient, sophisticated, the kind of working that required not just knowledge but bloodline authority to maintain. Inside, the fortress was warm and inhabited and much larger than its exterior suggested. Perhaps 60 people lived there. A mix of ages, a mix of what the Empire would have called background. A cook stirring something that smelled like actual food, 2 children running through a corridor with complete unconcern for authority, an old man at a table covered in maps, who looked up when Elira entered, and then looked at Mira with an expression that said something she couldn't yet read. Mira led her to a room often with a fire and 2 chairs and closed the door. "Sit," she said. Not unkindly, Elira sat. Mira remained standing, which Elira noted as a choice. "What do you know about the Veilborn Covenant?" "Nothing. Until 30 seconds ago, I would have said it didn't exist. The Empire would prefer that. It's the entire reason they destroyed every physical record of us." She moved to a shelf along the wall and took down a bound volume. Old, much older than anything in the Imperial archives, the leather cover worn to the softness of fabric. She set it on the table between them. 400 years ago, the House Kaelor rose to power through a military campaign that lasted 11 years. You have documented records of this. What the documents don't tell you is who they defeated. Alira looked at the book. "The Shadow Sovereigns," she said. "It came from somewhere below conscious memory, the way some knowledge does. Not recalled, but surfaced. The Noctur lineages." Mira's eyes sharpened. "You knew." "I found a single surviving reference, suppressed, no content, just the catalog entry." She looked up. "The Empire destroyed them. Destroyed most of them. The remaining families scattered and concealed. Your bloodline, what we believe is the direct descendant line of the last Noctur sovereign regent, went deepest underground. Your grandmother was placed inside Valdrake 3 generations ago as an insurance policy. A seed inside the Empire's own apparatus. Invisible. Safe." She paused. "It worked better than anyone planned. You became so invisible that even your own dormant blood went quiet. Until something activated it." Mira sat finally in the other chair. Sovereign blood responds to significant stress events, betrayal, loss, the specific kind of pain that comes from being discarded by someone whose opinion should not have mattered, but did. Her voice was even. "We felt the activation from here, 2 nights ago, like a lamp being lit in a dark house." Elira was quiet for a long moment. "You're saying my power woke up because of the bonding night. I'm saying that dormant things tend to know when their host has been left with nothing to lose." Mira looked at her directly. "Which is, historically, when sovereign bloodlines have done their most significant work." Outside the room, the fortress continued its quiet life. Somewhere a child laughed. The old man at the map table said something to someone in a low tone. Elira looked at her hands. They looked the same as they always had. Ink-stained, slightly calloused from years of handling paper and leather bindings. The hands of a woman who had chosen precision over everything else because precision was the only power she'd been allowed to exercise. "Show me something," she said. "Your pardon?" "If what you're saying is true, show me what I'm carrying. I'm not walking into a war, or whatever this is, on faith." She met Mira's eyes. "Show me the evidence." Mira looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood and she said, "Hold out your hand." Elira held out her hand. Mira placed the old book in it. And the moment Elira's fingers closed on the spine, the room changed. It didn't change visually. The fire was still burning, the chairs were still exactly where they were. But something under the surface of the air shifted, the way a conversation shifts when the real subject finally gets spoken aloud after an hour of approaching it sideways. And from the book cover, from the old leather and the older ink beneath it, something rose to meet Elira's grip. Warmth. Not heat, warmth, the specific temperature of recognition, and then the shadows in the room's corners moved. Not dramatically, not a performance, just a slow, quiet reorientation, as if darkness were a fluid thing that had decided to be closer to her specifically, to lean toward her the way plants lean toward windows, following some signal she hadn't consciously sent. She breathed. The shadows stilled. She lowered her hand. Mira was watching her with an expression that was not triumph, not vindication, but something closer to the complicated relief of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is not yet certain whether its arrival is good or terrible. 3 months, Elira said. I'm sorry? Give me 3 months. She set the book down on the table. Her hands were steady. To read everything you have, to understand what I'm carrying and what it can do and what it costs and what the actual history says. 3 months of work before anything else happens. She looked at Mira with the same flat directness she had brought to 6 years of archival work and 40 feet of smoke-filled hall and a long road east in the dark. Then we talk about what comes next. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 months. 3 months, Elira confirmed. She reached for the old book and opened it to the first page. In the capital, in the palace, in the room where the new century's most politically advantageous mate bond had just been sealed with ceremony and applause, Emperor Draven Kalor stood at his chamber window at the 4th hour of the night and looked east. He had told himself he was reviewing the military projections for the northern border dispute. He had told himself that the persistent unease in his chest was tiredness, or the residue of ceremony, or the particular weight of another consequential decision absorbed into a reign already crowded with them. He told himself these things with the efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years convincing himself that the narrative he maintained internally was identical to the truth. He was, by most measurable standards, correct. He had made the right choice. The Thorn Alliance secured 3 contested provinces without a single casualty. It realigned the Eastern trade situation, neutralized a potential rival power structure, and sent a message to the other major houses about the Emperor's priorities that would reverberate usefully for years. From every analytical angle, from every angle that the Empire's survival required him to operate from, he had done exactly what needed to be done. And yet, he stood at the window and looked east and felt, at the edge of his instincts, something that he had no appropriate file category for. Not guilt. Guilt was a luxury. He had decided this early. Not longing. He had decided that too. What he felt was more like the sensation of having made a calculation with a missing variable, the disquiet of an equation that doesn't resolve, not because the math is wrong, but because the problem is larger than the framework you've applied to it. He put it away. He was practiced at putting things away. But 3 days later, when his intelligence director placed a brief report on his desk about an unusual activation event detected by the Eastern Sensitives, something described as a bloodline resonance of significant magnitude, originating from somewhere beyond the imperial boundary, of a type not recorded in the last 200 years, he read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He set it face down on the desk. He sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the wood. The bonding night was 4 days past. The timing was not something he could dismiss. He also, for the first time in 15 years of disciplined power management, felt the bond that he had refused to acknowledge. Not through the instinctive warmth he had identified and overruled in the ceremony hall, but through something else. Through a frequency that was beginning, quietly and without his permission, to shift from the register of heartbreak into something harder to name, something that felt distantly and impossibly like awakening power. He filed the intelligence report under sensitive with no further notation. He did not sleep. In the Ashen Territories, Elira Voss read through the night by firelight, and the shadows of the room moved slowly around her like a tide finding its shore, and the book in her hands gave up its secrets page by page with the particular patience of knowledge that has been waiting a very long time to be found by the right reader. She was on page 47 when she found the passage that would change the shape of everything. It was a record of the old law, the law that had governed the Nocthur lineages before the Empire decided to erase them. Not a military law or a political law, but an older kind, written in the language of bloodlines and consequences. The law stated, in the archaic phrasing she was now reading with increasing fluency, that a sovereign regent could not come fully into power while the bond remained open. And it stated in the next line, with a clarity that the centuries had not diminished, that an unacknowledged bond between a sovereign and an alpha of rival bloodline did not simply weaken over time, it transmuted into something that could not be severed, into something that would eventually, on its own timeline, by its own logic, immune to either party's preferences, force a reckoning. She stared at the page. The fire crackled. The shadows pressed closer. She was thinking, with a cold precision that felt almost new, about gray eyes in a smoke-filled hall, and about the fact that somewhere across the miles of mountain and dark road between them, the man who had looked at her and looked away was now in possession of intelligence reports about her activation, which meant he was already tracking her, which meant that the time she had assumed she had was not the time she actually had. She was thinking this when the old man knocked on the door and put his head in and said, in the tone of a person delivering terrible news with the flatness of someone accustomed to terrible news, "We have a problem." "What problem?" Illyra said. He looked at her with the map-covered table expression, the one she still couldn't fully read. "There's an Imperial Scout unit," he said, "at the boundary marker." A pause. 6 riders. Moving fast. Moving like they know where they're going. Illyra closed the book. She set it on the table. She stood. And for the first time since the Hall of 1,000 Fires, she felt something that was not grief, not fury, not the patient slow burn of humiliation in a golden room. She felt something harder than all of those things. Something that had been, until approximately 2 hours ago, dormant. "How long?" she said. 2 hours. Maybe less if they know the path. She looked at her hands one more time. The shadows in the room were completely still, waiting, arranged around her in the specific quiet of things that have chosen a direction. "Wake Mira," she said. "We have work to do." 3 hours later, the 6 Imperial Scouts reached the place where the mountain path had been. They found no path. They found no fortress. They found cold mountain air and the particular disorientation of a ward older than the Empire that made men doubt their own memory of why they'd come. What they did not find was any evidence of Illyra Voss. The lead scout sent a message back to the capital. Territory clear, no significant findings. In his office, reading the message by lamplight, Emperor Draven Kalor was still for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the window that faced east. And this time, what he felt through the channel of a bond he had refused to acknowledge was not heartbreak, and it was not power in the distant, unfamiliar frequency of someone else's awakening. It was absence, complete, sudden, as if someone had shut a door between them that he had not known was open until the moment it closed. He stood at the window for a long time. Then his intelligence director knocked and entered, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone carrying news that had no comfortable container. "We've received confirmation from the Veilborn records we retrieved last quarter," she said. "The bloodline signature detected 4 days ago." She set a document on his desk. "It matches," she said. "The last Noctur Sovereign line. Direct descent." A pause that had weight in it. "Sire, if this is accurate, if she's alive and active and beyond our borders, then everything we know about the Imperial succession is built on—" "I know," Draven said. His voice was flat. His back was still to her. "Leave it," he said. She left. He stood at the window alone, and the east was dark, and somewhere in it was a woman he had rejected in front of 10,000 witnesses who was apparently not what any of them had believed she was, and who had apparently just done something to the bond between them that he could not yet name. And he thought, with the specific feeling of a foundation shifting, that he had made the right choice for every reason he had used to make it. And he thought, what if all those reasons are wrong? What if they were always wrong? The East gave him no answer. It never would. That was not the direction answers came from in the Empire. Answers came from conquest, from force, from the certainty of a man who had never, in 15 years of ruling, encountered a problem that strength could not eventually solve. He was about to learn what kind of strength he had never once considered, and it was going to come from the direction he had decided did not need watching. The war did not simply hide the fortress. It rewrote the memory of the path. That was the precise and unsettling distinction Illyra had come to understand in the 3 days since the Imperial Scouts had stood at the boundary and turned back without knowing why. A ward of that age and complexity did not deceive. Deception implies an alternative truth running alongside the false one, and the Noctur warding tradition had never been interested in alternatives. It operated on the principle of revision. The path had existed. The Scouts had walked it, and then, at the ward's edge, that knowledge had been gently, surgically excised from their understanding the way a skilled archivist removes a page from a binding, leaving no torn edge, no visible absence, only the smooth continuity of a document that had always contained exactly what it currently contained. She found this philosophically interesting. She also found it deeply clarifying about the nature of the empire she had served for 6 years. Valdrake had been doing the same thing for 4 centuries, just with ink and institutional authority instead of bloodline power. The mechanism was identical. Only the medium differed. Mira had given her 3 things after the scouts withdrew: uninterrupted access to the Covenant's archive, a room with a working fireplace and a north-facing window, and the kind of silence that serious people extend to other serious people when they recognize that thinking is happening and thinking requires time. Alira used all 3 without ceremony. She read for 18 hours out of every 24. She slept in 4-hour intervals and woke with the book already in her hand, because somewhere between the first night and the third, her body had stopped treating sleep as a priority and started treating the archive as one. The knock-their-old tongue came back to her in layers. That was the only way to describe it. Not learning, but remembering, the way you remember how to swim when you're back in water. Muscle knowledge reactivating below the level of conscious instruction. The cipher had been the lock, and the lineage was the key, and once the key turned, the archive opened. What it contained reordered her entire understanding of the world. On the morning of the 4th day, she went to find Mira. She found her in the room with the maps, standing across the table from the old man, whose name she had learned was Castor. He had been born inside the Empire, had defected to the Covenant at 32 after discovering what his family's merchant records concealed about the erasure, and had spent the 30 years since becoming the most comprehensive living expert on the geography of everything Valdrake had decided it didn't need. They both looked up when she walked in. She put both hands flat on the table and said, "The massacre wasn't just military." Mira and Castor exchanged a glance that meant they had been waiting for her to reach this page. "It was a succession purge," Alira said. "The first Kaelor Emperor didn't defeat the Shadow Sovereigns in battle. He invited 12 of them to a peace summit and had them killed at the table. The military campaign came after, mopping up the houses that hadn't attended. The ones who survived were the ones paranoid enough not to trust an invitation." She looked at Mira. "My grandmother's line survived because they were paranoid." "Correctly," Castor said. "The Imperial founding document, the Covenant of Dominance, which I personally cataloged at the Records Hall, which is displayed under glass in the Hall of Succession as the sacred text of Kaelor legitimacy, is a fabrication." She said this without inflection, the way you say a thing you've needed to say aloud in order to fully believe it. It references a peaceful unification, the voluntary submission of the old bloodlines to the stronger crown. That is a document constructed on the bones of 12 murdered rulers. Mira sat down. "Yes," she said, "and Draven doesn't know." A longer pause. "We believe he doesn't know," Mira said, and the careful qualification of that sentence told Alira everything she needed to know about how the Covenant assessed the Emperor's culpability. Alira straightened. "Then he's either a man ruling in genuine ignorance of what his crown stands on, or he's a man so committed to the myth of his own legitimacy that he has never asked the question." She looked at the maps on the table, Valdrake's provinces, the border territories, the blank space that the Empire had labeled only as Eastern Waste. "Either way, the answer to the next question is the same." "What's the next question?" Castor said. "How long do we have before they send something bigger than scouts?" It was not 3 months. She had known that the moment she read the bonding law in the old book, the law that stated an unacknowledged bond between a sovereign and an alpha of rival bloodline would force a reckoning on its own terms, regardless of what either party preferred. She had spent a day resisting that knowledge, because resistance is the first response of a rational mind to information it doesn't like. And she was a rational mind. Then she had accepted it and moved on, because the second response of a rational mind to information it doesn't like is to extract the tactical advantage contained within it. The bond was a liability she had not asked for and could not remove. It was also a signal, and signals moved in both directions. "He felt the ward close," she said. Mira looked at her with the specific attention of a person recalibrating. "We don't know that," Mira said. "I do. Not because I can prove it, because I know what it felt like from this side, and the bond doesn't work like a one-way mirror." She was very calm saying this. That was the thing she noticed about herself in these days. The emotion had not disappeared, not by any means, but it had moved, gone somewhere deeper and more load-bearing, the way structural elements move below the surface of a building, invisible from outside, but responsible for everything standing upright. He felt it close, which means he knows I'm alive and capable of something, which means the scouts were the first question, not the last one. Castor had pulled a specific map to the top of the pile. If they send a military unit, they won't. She looked at the map. Not yet. He'll send someone he trusts, someone who can assess what he's actually dealing with before he decides what it requires. She paused. The way he operates, everything I observed in 6 years of palace proximity, he gathers information before he commits force. Force is the last answer, not the first. That's what makes him dangerous. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know him." "I know his decision-making pattern." Alira's voice was flat. "That is not the same thing." It was, of course, not entirely accurate, but accuracy had never been the point of that particular distinction. The point was to maintain the boundary between what she had observed professionally and what she had felt, involuntarily and inconveniently, across 40 feet of ceremonial smoke. The two things needed to remain separate categories. She was going to need both of them operational, and they could not function as one thing. "We have weeks," she said. "Maybe less. I need access to everything the Covenant has on Nocthur's current potential. Who we can reach, what resources exist in the territories, what the state of the old lineage networks looks like." She looked at Mira. "And I need to understand the full extent of what I'm carrying, not just theoretically. Actually." Mira looked at her for a long moment. "The last sovereign regent who came into full power," she said, "was your great-great-grandmother. The process took 6 months and was not comfortable. Compress it. Alira, I don't have 6 months. Compress it." The silence between them had a particular texture, the texture of a more experienced person recognizing that the less experienced person has arrived at a level of clarity that makes experience temporarily irrelevant. "We start tomorrow," Mira said. What happened in the days that followed was not what Alira would have called comfortable. That was the accurate word. Not painful, not traumatic. Those words implied an external force applied to an unwilling recipient. What Mira and Castor and the Covenant's surviving bloodline workers did was closer to excavation. They removed layers. Not of the person, she remained herself, precisely and stubbornly herself throughout, but of the suppression. The 3 generations of careful, loving, survival-motivated concealment that her family had layered over the sovereign blood, like insulation over a live wire. Removing insulation from a live wire is technically straightforward. The wire then does what live wires do. The first time it happened fully, without the reflex of suppression catching it, she was in the fortress courtyard at dusk. Mira was standing 15 feet away. Alira had been attempting something specific, a reaching exercise. The old tongue's word for it translated roughly as extension of dominion, and she had been attempting it with the controlled effort of someone trying to do a thing correctly rather than powerfully. Then Mira said quietly, "Stop trying to do it correctly. Just want it." And Alira stopped trying, and the courtyard went dark. Not fully dark. The sky was still the sky, still the specific blue-going gray of a mountain dusk. But every shadow in the space, every area of low light, every corner and overhang and space beneath the stone stairs oriented simultaneously toward her with a collective liquid motion, like a tide responding to the moon, and the sensation was not power in the way she had expected power to feel. Not force, not violence, but more like being heard for the first time by something very large and very old that had been waiting for precisely her voice. She let out a breath. The shadows held their position. "Good," Mira said. "It doesn't feel like a weapon," Alira said. "It's not." Mira walked toward her across the courtyard, through the arrayed shadows, which moved carefully around her feet like water around a stone. The old sovereigns weren't warriors. They were arbiters. The Shadow Dominion is an authority, not an arsenal. It does what authority does. It creates the conditions in which other forces operate. She stopped in front of Alira and looked at her with an expression that was complicated. The Empire feared them not because they could destroy armies, because they could change what armies believed. Alira absorbed this. She thought about the Hall of 1,000 Fires. She thought about 10,000 witnesses. She thought about the gap between what an empire believes about itself and what is documented in its suppressed archives, and what happens to an empire when those two things are forced into the same room. "Show me the rest," she said. Here's what the story requires you to understand about Draven Kalor at this point in his life, because the narrative does him no justice if it reduces him to a simple antagonist, and simple antagonists do not produce complicated truths. He was not a cruel man. This is the important thing that courts and enemies in history tend to flatten in the telling. He was not a man who enjoyed harm. He was a man who had, at the age of 17, watched his father's court destroyed by a combination of sentiment and strategic incompetence, who had watched a man he loved and respected make decisions from his heart rather than his head, and lose everything to a council that had been sharpening its knives for years. He had survived that collapse. He had rebuilt from it. He had built an empire's worth of rebuilt from it, and the philosophy underneath all of it, the foundational code, was not cruelty. It was the categorical refusal to allow sentiment to outweigh strategy. Sentiment was the thing that had destroyed his father. Sentiment was the thing that had nearly destroyed him. So he had made a decision, young and grieving and entirely serious about it, to become the kind of ruler who could not be undone by feeling. To be the alpha who held the crown through something more durable than love or loyalty or instinct. To hold it through the pure, cold geometry of correct decisions correctly made. It had worked. For 15 years, it had worked. The empire was stronger than it had ever been under his predecessors. The borders were stable. The houses were managed. The military was loyal, not out of affection, but out of respect, which is the more reliable form. Everything he had built was built on the foundation of that philosophy. And then a woman he had never spoken to looked at him across a ceremonial hall, and something in him had recognized something in her. And for exactly 3 seconds, he had felt the foundational code crack. He had closed the crack immediately. He had done what needed to be done. He had been right. He told himself this every morning in the 12 days since the bonding night with the consistency of a man who has decided that repetition is a form of proof. He reviewed the decision against every available metric. The Thorn Alliance was already yielding strategic dividends. Veressa was an intelligent and capable partner who understood the transactional nature of what they had agreed to and did not require him to be something other than what he was. The Empire was well served. He had been right. On the 13th morning, his intelligence director, Commander Sella Vane, 20 years in the service, loyalty-tested and proven, the kind of person you keep not because they tell you what you want to hear, but because they tell you what you need to, came to his office and set a second document on his desk. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me." "The sensitivity array picked up a second resonance event 3 days ago," she said. "Larger than the first, significantly larger. The array hasn't recorded a reading of this magnitude in the 200 years it's been operational." She paused. "We cross-referenced with every known bloodline in active status. There are no matches in the Imperial Registry." "Because it's not in the Imperial Registry." "No." She was watching him with the specific care of someone who has prepared for multiple versions of this conversation and is not yet certain which version they're in. The classification matches the suppressed Nocthur lineage records, the ones from the Erasure Archive. Draven was quiet. He was very good at silence. Most powerful people are, because silence in the presence of information is a form of control. It refuses to give the information the satisfaction of a visible reaction, which keeps the balance of power in the silent party's favor. But the silence this time was also because he was managing something else, something in the register of the bond, which had gone quiet in a way that was not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of distance, like a sound you can no longer hear because the source has moved, but the frequency is still technically present, still technically reachable. If you were inclined to reach, he was not inclined to reach. "Who else has seen this report?" he said. "Myself. The 2 technicians who operate the array. I told them it was a calibration anomaly and required their silence pending investigation." "Good." He looked at the document. The numbers on the resonance reading were, even to his untrained eye, not small. "I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Not the political interpretation. I can construct that myself. The actual nature of what this bloodline is capable of." Sella reached into the folder she was carrying and produced a third document. "I anticipated that. I pulled the pre-erasure historical records, the ones from the Vault Archive, not the public registry, and had them translated overnight." She set this one on the desk as well. "It's not comfortable reading." He looked at her. Tell me the part I need to know first. She met his eyes with the directness that was the reason she had her job. The Shadow Sovereigns didn't fight the Empire with armies. They fought it with authority. Their bloodline ability operates on something the old records call dominion of perception, the capacity to change what people believe is true, not through deception, but through direct influence on the mechanisms of certainty. She paused. If a sovereign regent came fully into power and chose to use that dominion against an empire built on revised history, they wouldn't need to destroy it, Draven said. His voice was flat. No. They just need to make everyone stop believing in it. Yes. The room was very quiet. Draven stood and walked to the window. The east was, as always, the east. Mountains in the far distance, blue with distance and indifference. Somewhere past those mountains, in territory his empire had decided wasn't worth maintaining, a woman he had rejected in front of 10,000 people was apparently in the process of becoming the single largest threat to everything he had spent 15 years building. The calculation assembled itself in his mind with the automatic efficiency of a thing that has been calculated 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different forms. Neutralize the threat. Identify the asset. Determine the cost of acquisition versus the cost of confrontation. Execute whichever option preserves the most strategic value. He had run this calculation on border disputes and succession crises and assassination attempts and trade wars. He had never run it on a bond. There is another factor, Selah said, carefully. He turned from the window. She was looking at the report in a way that said she had been deciding whether to include this part. The pre-erasure records document the nature of the bond between sovereign bloodlines and rival alpha lineages, she said. Specifically, what happens when such a bond is activated and then rejected by the Alpha Party. He said nothing. The bond does not dissolve, she said. According to 3 separate primary sources from the period before the erasure, the rejection of a sovereign bond by an alpha of sufficient bloodline strength does not end the connection. It transforms it. She met his eyes. Into something the old records describe as a forcing point, a moment that the bond itself, not either party, but the mechanism of the bond, moves both parties toward inevitably, a direct encounter, a reckoning. The silence this time was of a different quality. When? He said. The old records don't specify a timeline, they specify conditions. She looked at the document. Full activation of the sovereign blood, recognition of the historical claim, and what the text calls the gathering of the sovereign court, the assembly of a legitimate power base. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Valdrake went about the business of being an empire. Carts on the stone roads below, guards on the palace walls. The ordinary machinery of a dominion operating at full functional capacity, completely unaware that its foundational certainties were currently being excavated by a woman in a mountain fortress, with the patience of a scholar and the blood of the people his great-great-grandfather had killed to make it all possible. How close is she? He said. To full activation? To all of it. Selah put the documents together in a careful stack. If the resonance readings are accurate, weeks, perhaps less. He nodded once. He went back to the desk. He sat down. And then he did something that Selah had not seen him do in 6 years of service. He put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands, and he stayed there for a moment that was not long but was longer than any moment she had ever witnessed from him. And she understood without being told that she was not meant to interpret this or report it or mention it afterward. He raised his head. His face was composed again. Controlled. The machinery of control operating exactly as designed. I'm going myself, he said. Selah went very still. Sire, not with an army, not with a diplomatic entourage. He looked at her with the full weight of 15 years of correct decisions behind his eyes. 3 riders, myself, you, and Kael. Commander Kael Drovish, his personal guard, a man so loyal that loyalty had become architectural, a structural feature of who Kael was, rather than a choice he continued to make. We go east. We find what we're dealing with. And then we decide. If she's as powerful as the readings suggest, then going with an army accomplishes nothing except telling her we're afraid. He looked at the document, at the resonance numbers. An alpha who shows fear to a threat of this magnitude doesn't deserve the crown he's trying to protect. He stood. We leave at dawn. Selah looked at him for a moment. Understood, she said. She left. He stood alone in the office. He thought about the bond, about the specific quality of its silence since the ward had closed. Not absence, as he had tried to convince himself, but distance. The difference mattered. Absence meant gone. Distance meant still there, still connected, still pulling at the specific frequency that he had refused to acknowledge since the night of bonding, that he had filed under strategic override and buried under 15 years of correct decisions. He thought about what Sela had said, a forcing point, a reckoning the bond itself moves both parties toward. He thought, with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of the option to not think clearly, what does it mean that the most significant threat to my empire is the woman I rejected, and what does it mean about my rejection that it produced this? He did not have the answer. He had spent 15 years being the man who had the answer. He pulled on his traveling coat. He went to find his horse. Elira was in the archive room when Mira knocked and entered with the expression that had come to mean incoming information of strategic significance. "We have eyes at the Eastern Capitol Road," Mira said. "Small group, moving fast, moving light." She paused. 3 riders. Elira set down the document she was reading. She looked at Mira. "Who leads them?" Mira's answer was exactly one word. It landed in the room with the weight of everything she had spent 23 days building toward. Every page of the archive, every hour of excavation, every shadow in the courtyard that had learned the frequency of her voice. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about gray eyes in a smoke-filled hall. She thought about a door closing. She thought about the bonding law and the forcing point and the specific mechanism of a reckoning that neither party could prevent. She stood. She walked to the north-facing window and looked out at the mountains and the road that the ward would show him as empty until she decided otherwise. She could close it again. She knew that now. She had learned enough in 23 days to maintain the ward from the inside, to keep 3 Imperial riders circling in confused revision for as long as she needed. She could send him home. She could buy more time to prepare, more time to gather the lineage networks Castor had been quietly contacting, to build what the old records called the Sovereign Court, to come to full power on her own terms and her own timeline, untouched by his presence and everything it complicated. She could do all of that. She stood at the window for a long time, and then she said, "Let him through." Mira was quiet. "Elira," she said, "let him through." Her voice was very even. "If this is what the bond is going to do regardless, I choose when and where and how. Not the mechanism, not the bond, not him." She turned from the window. "And not on his terms." She looked at Mira with the full weight of 23 days of excavation and 6 years of invisible patience, and 1 night in a ceremonial hall that had cost her everything she had been and given her, in return, everything she was about to become. "He wants to assess what he's dealing with," she said. "Let him." She smoothed her coat. She walked toward the door. "Then let him see it." The ward dropped, and somewhere on the mountain road below, in the cold air of an eastern morning, 3 riders felt the path appear beneath them where no path had been, and the one in the lead, the one with gray eyes and a crown he had not brought with him and a philosophy built on 15 years of correct decisions, felt something through a bond he had refused to acknowledge. Not heartbreak, not power in the unfamiliar register of someone else's awakening. He felt a door open, from the inside, deliberately, and he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has spent his life being the one who opens doors, that he had just been invited, on someone else's terms. For the first time in 15 years, Emperor Draven Kalor rode toward something he did not know how to calculate, and the woman waiting at the other end of the road had spent 23 days making sure that when he arrived, everything he thought he knew would need a different name. The ward came down like a held breath finally released. Draven felt it through the soles of his boots before he saw it. A vibration in the mountain road beneath his horse that was not geological, not wind, not any of the physical phenomena he could have named with confidence. It was the sensation of a boundary condition changing, of a perimeter that had been maintained by will deciding, also by will, to stop. The path appeared ahead of them with the quiet matter-of-factness of something that had always been there and had simply been unavailable until now, and he understood without requiring explanation that this was not discovery. It was invitation. He pulled his horse to a stop. Sela drew up beside him. Kael, 3 lengths back, closed the distance without being asked. The three of them sat on the mountain road in the early morning cold and looked at the path that had not existed 20 seconds ago. "She knows we're here," Sella said. "She's known since the ward closed the first time." He kept his voice level. "She let us find the path because she decided to, not because our scouts were clever." He looked at the mountain ahead, stone and shadow and the particular silence of high altitude in the hour after dawn. "We go in understanding that." "We go in at her invitation," Kael said. He was not a man who used many words, but the ones he used tended to contain the weight of several more. "Yes," Draven said. "Then we go in without advantage." "We were never going to have advantage, not against what she's carrying." He looked at Kael, then at Sella. "We go in with information, and we go in with the only thing an alpha has when force isn't the answer." Sella looked at him. "Which is?" she said. He clicked his horse forward onto the path. "Honesty," he said. "Let's find out if it's enough." The fortress appeared as they crested the third ridge. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical grandeur of an imperial palace designed to produce awe as a form of control. It appeared the way honest things appear, gradually and without apology, becoming more itself the closer you got rather than less. Stone. Functional. Old in the way that suggested it had survived things by being more interested in continuing to stand than in impressing anyone. There were people at the gate. 2 of them. A silver-haired woman and an older man standing without ceremony in the cold morning air. Not armed, not visibly, not performing threat or submission, just present. Draven dismounted without waiting for Kael's security assessment. He heard Kael's slight intake of breath, the professional's objection to the principal taking action before the perimeter was evaluated, and he ignored it because the perimeter had already been evaluated by whoever was watching from above, and the decision about whether he was allowed inside had already been made before he got off his horse. He walked to the gate. The silver-haired woman looked at him with the direct, unimpressed attention of someone who has been watching emperors make decisions for long enough to have opinions about the quality of those decisions. "You came light," she said. 3 riders. He met her eyes. "I didn't come to fight." "What did you come to do?" "Understand what I'm dealing with." A pause. "And be understood, if that's available." She looked at him for a moment. "My name is Mira," she said. "I lead the Veil-born Covenant. You are standing on the sovereign territory of Nocthur, which your empire erased from its maps 400 years ago, and which is still here anyway." She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "Come inside." She turned and walked through the gate. Draven followed. This is where the story requires a pause. Not a softening, but a precision. Because what happened inside the fortress over the next 3 hours was not what Draven had prepared himself for. And it is important to understand why that preparation failure matters. He had prepared for a confrontation. He was good at confrontations. He had built his entire ruling philosophy on the management of opposing forces. And he was, by any honest accounting, exceptionally skilled at it. He had prepared for a negotiation. He was good at those too, in the particular way of a man who understands that negotiation is just confrontation with better vocabulary. He had prepared, at the outer edge of his scenario modeling, for something like an audience with a power he had not previously understood. He had not prepared for an archive. Mira brought him to a room full of documents, old documents, pre-imperial documents, the kind of material that the records hall he'd employed Alira to maintain had specifically not contained. And she did not argue with him or threaten him or make demands. She simply put the documents in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "Read." Sella was beside him. Kael was at the door. He read. He read for 2 hours in a silence that was not comfortable and was not meant to be. Sella read alongside him, and he could tell from the way her breathing pattern changed at specific pages that she was encountering the same material he was encountering in the same sequence, and arriving at the same sequence of conclusions. The Founding Massacre. The Fabricated Covenant of Dominance. The 12 rulers who had accepted a peace invitation and been killed at the table. The military campaign that had swept up the survivors under the official narrative of voluntary unification. The record of his great-great-grandfather's orders, in the man's own hand, preserved in the Covenant's archive because the Covenant had been built specifically around the preservation of exactly this material. He set down the last document. He looked at the table. Then he said, Where is she? Mira looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and was not sympathetic. That depends on what you intend to say to her. I intend to say what the situation requires. Which is what exactly? He looked up from the table. That these documents change things. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and walked to the door and said, "Follow me." She was in the courtyard. He recognized her from 40 feet the way he had recognized her across a ceremonial hall. Not visually, not because the silver-black coat and the changed posture and the completely altered quality of her presence in a physical space weren't significant, but because recognition operated below visual processing when the mechanism doing the recognizing was a bond. She was standing in the center of the courtyard with her back to the entrance, looking at the mountain wall to the north, and the shadows around her. He noticed this with the specific attention of a man who has just read 2 hours of documentation about what sovereign blood actually does. The shadows were arranged, not randomly, not in response to light and architecture, in response to her. He had filed the resonance readings under intelligence requiring assessment. Standing in the courtyard, he understood that the gap between intelligence requiring assessment and the actual thing was the gap between reading about fire and standing in it. She turned. He had spent 12 days building a narrative about what this moment would be. An emperor and a threat, a ruler and a complication. A man and the strategic problem created by a decision he had made correctly by every available metric. She looked at him and the narrative collapsed. Not because of the bond, though the bond was there, still there, changed in the way Selah had described. Altered, transmuted, something different from what it had been in the hall, but not gone. Not even close to gone. It collapsed because of her face, which was the face of someone who has been through something furnace hot and come out the other side not softer but more themselves, and because of her eyes, which had never been soft and were less soft now, and were also, beneath the flatness of deliberate control, doing the thing that eyes do when they contain more than the face is currently allowing. "You read the archive," she said. Not a question. She had been informed, presumably. "Yes," he said. "And?" He said, "And my empire was built on a massacre." The words sat in the mountain air between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that neither of them could stop. "Your empire was built on a lie," she said. "The massacre is just what the lie required." He looked at her. "That's a meaningful distinction." "Yes, it is." She walked toward him, not aggressively, not with the body language of someone closing distance for confrontation, but with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided that the space between them is no longer something she will permit the situation to manage. Because a lie is a choice. Someone decided to build what you inherited on a foundation of rewritten history. You didn't make that choice, but you have benefited from it every day for 15 years, and you will continue to benefit from it until someone forces the accounting. "Is that what you're doing?" he said. "Forcing the accounting." "I'm doing what the blood requires," she said, "which is the same thing, just with different language." They were 6 feet apart now. The shadows in the courtyard were very still. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't know." That matters. It matters for your culpability. It doesn't change the foundation. She looked at him with the flat directness that he had seen years ago, as the expression of an archivist so practiced at invisibility that she had forgotten she had a face, and that he now understood was the expression of someone who had spent their entire life performing safety and had stopped. "You came here to assess the threat. You've assessed it. What do you intend to do with what you found?" This is the question that defines a ruler's actual character, not the decisions made in comfort, with time and counsel and the full apparatus of a functioning court providing the infrastructure of considered judgment. The character-defining decisions are the ones made in the cold, with 3 people and no apparatus, standing in front of the consequence of a previous decision and being asked, "Now what?" Draven had run his empire on the principle that correct decisions could always be defended by their outcomes. He was standing in front of an outcome that could not be defended. "I don't know yet," he said, and the honesty of it, the actual unqualified honesty of a man who has never, in 15 years, permitted himself to not know, landed in the space between them with a weight that surprised them both. Alira looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "At least that's true." She turned and walked back toward the fortress entrance. She said, without stopping, "You'll stay tonight. We'll talk more in the morning. Don't mistake hospitality for trust." He watched her go. Kael appeared at his shoulder. "Sire?" "I heard her," he said. "Are we staying?" He looked at the entrance she had disappeared through, at the fortress that had not existed on any imperial map for 400 years and was still standing anyway, at the mountain air and the shadow-stilled courtyard, and the particular quality of a situation that had moved, without his permission, outside the boundaries of every framework he had built for managing situations. "Yes," he said. "We're staying." The betrayal came at the second hour past midnight. This is the nature of the most consequential betrayals. They do not arrive when you are prepared for them. They arrive in the hour when preparation has been suspended by exhaustion and the particular lowering of vigilance that comes from a day of confronting things you did not expect to confront. When the body and mind have been doing the heavy work of recalibration and the mechanisms of alert have been, briefly, deprioritized. The first sound was Kael, not Kael's voice. A sound involving Kael, a brief percussive interruption from the corridor outside Draven's assigned room that had the specific quality of a man who is very good at remaining quiet, being prevented from doing so. Draven was on his feet before full consciousness arrived, the body's training running faster than thought, and he had the door open in the time it took most people to register that they'd heard something. The corridor. Kael was on the ground, not dead by the rising of his chest, but down, which meant someone had gotten past the most capable personal guard in the Imperial military. Sella's room door was open, the room empty. The torches that lined the corridor had been reduced to one, the far end, casting a light barely sufficient to navigate by. 3 men stood between Draven and the stairwell, not Covenant people. He knew that immediately, not from any single feature, but from the aggregate of posture, equipment, the particular configuration of armed men who are operating under orders rather than principle. These were Imperial soldiers. Specifically, the kind of Imperial soldiers who are given assignments that do not appear in official deployment records. His council's men. His stomach went cold. "Where's Vane?" he said. The man in the center, older, the one in charge, the face of someone who has done difficult things under the cover of institutional authority for long enough that difficulty no longer registers on his expression, said, "Commander Vane is secured. The Emperor will come with us." The possessive was deliberate. The Emperor. Not you. The designation of a category rather than a person. The thing they were retrieving, not the man they were addressing. Draven looked at him. "Who sent you?" he said. "The High Council acts in the Empire's best interest when the Emperor's judgment is compromised." The High Council. The words came out flat and very precise. "My council. The council I appointed. The council that has been informed of my whereabouts and my purpose and my assessment of this situation." He looked at the 3 men. "They decided my judgment was compromised. You rode into enemy territory with 3 people, the man said. You spent the day in extended conference with the leader of an illegal separatist organization. You are currently housed as a guest in a facility that represents an active threat to imperial sovereignty." He paused. The council determined that protective intervention was warranted. Protective intervention. Here is what that phrase contains, unwrapped from its institutional language. The High Council of Valdrake, 12 men Draven had personally appointed to the highest advisory positions in the Empire, had sent a covert extraction team into foreign territory to remove their emperor from a diplomatic contact he had authorized himself. Not to protect him, to stop him from doing something the council had decided should not be done. They had decided to 12 men in a room somewhere behind the mountains, that an emperor who might be moving toward accountability was a greater threat to their interests than an emperor who was absent. Power does not fear enemies. It fears accountability, because enemies can be defeated, contained, eliminated. Accountability is different. Accountability requires a reckoning with what power has actually been, underneath the mythology it has constructed around itself. And the people most invested in preventing that reckoning are never the ruler's external opponents. They are the ones inside the walls, the ones who have spent their careers building their own influence on the same foundation of convenient fiction, the ones whose position depends on the fiction remaining intact. His council had built 30 years of political influence on the legitimacy of the Kaelor crown. If the crown was revealed as stolen legacy, so was everything beneath it. Draven understood this. He understood it the way you understand a thing that has been true for a long time and has just, in one corridor in the middle of the night, become unavoidable. "You're making a mistake," he said. "The council's assessment—" "Not you," he said. "Them. They're making a mistake." He looked at the corridor, at Kael on the ground, at the single torch at the far end. "Because they think this situation can still be contained. They think if they bring me back and manage the narrative, the problem disappears." He looked at the extraction team. "The problem is not me being here. The problem is what's in the archive, and the archive exists whether I'm here or not." The man in the center was unmoved. He had been sent to do a specific thing, and he was going to do it. "Come with us," he said. "Or we do this the other way." Draven said, "What's the other way?" "We take the Emperor and we make sure the facility can't produce the kind of documentation that destabilizes a functioning government." He held the Emperor's gaze with the flat patience of a man who understands that the statement he has just made is understood by everyone in the corridor. "The Council is very concerned about security. The archive, the documents, the 2 centuries of preserved evidence that a sovereign lineage had been maintaining specifically because this moment, the moment when it could not be ignored, would eventually arrive." Draven stood in the corridor, the cold air of the mountain fortress, the single torch at the far end. Kael breathing on the floor. He thought about the documents, the founding massacre, the fabricated covenant, his great-great-grandfather's orders in his own hand. He thought about what it means when the people who benefit most from a lie decide the lie is worth killing to preserve. It is not, at that point, simply a political calculation. It is a revelation of character, the moment when the infrastructure of justification falls away, and what remains is the bare machinery of people protecting their position at any cost. He thought about Elira. In the room somewhere above him, the woman he had rejected in front of 10,000 witnesses was asleep or awake in an archive full of evidence that his council had just decided to destroy. And the bond he had refused for 30 days now, the bond he had filed under strategic override and managed with the cold precision of a man who does not permit himself to feel what he is feeling, sent him, in the second before decision, something that was not a thought and was not an emotion, but was closer to a signal. She was awake. She had heard something. He made the decision in the time it takes to exhale. He turned and ran, not away from the extraction team, not toward the stairwell they were blocking. He turned and put his shoulder into the corridor wall and went through the secondary passage Castor had shown him that afternoon, the fortress architect's solution to exactly this kind of problem, because the Covenant had built every inch of this place with the assumption that at some point someone would come to destroy it. He heard the extraction team moving behind him. He moved faster. The passage opened into the archive room. She was already at the shelves, not panicking, not frantic, moving with the systematic urgency of someone who has identified the most critical material and is executing a prioritized extraction. Her coat was on, her journal was in her hand, and she was pulling specific volumes from the archive with the selectivity of someone who has spent 6 years learning which documents matter most. She looked up when he came through the passage. Their eyes met. "Your council sent people," he said. "I know. I heard Kael." She pulled another volume. "How many?" "3 that I saw. More outside, likely." He crossed to the shelves. "Tell me what needs to go." She looked at him. The look lasted half a second, which in the specific arithmetic of a situation with a ticking timer was a full accounting of whether he was to be trusted and what the cost of getting that assessment wrong was. He understood the look. He would have performed the same calculation. She handed him a stack of volumes. "Everything on that shelf," she said. "And the case in the corner, the sealed one. Don't open it, just carry it." He went to the shelf. He went to the corner. He moved with the focused efficiency of a man who has, in his military career, operated in exactly this register, the register of extracting critical assets under active threat with minimal resources. And for a moment, moving through the archive beside her with his arms full of the documentation that his empire had tried to erase, he had the disorienting clarity of understanding that he was on the right side of this action. Not the strategic side, Not the side he had calculated, the right side. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He did not have time to examine it. Mira appeared in the archive doorway with Castor behind her and two of the Covenant's people behind him. "They've breached the south gate," she said. "We have one exit that they haven't reached yet. 2 minutes, maybe less." Elira looked at the shelves. She looked at what remained. She made the calculation of a person who has spent her life understanding that preservation is sometimes about choosing what survives, not saving everything. "Leave the rest," she said. "Elira, we have the founding records. We have the massacre documentation. We have the bloodline archive." Her voice was very steady. "We have what we need to do what needs to be done. Leave the rest." She turned to the exit. She stopped. She looked at Draven. He was standing with the case and the volumes, looking at her with the expression of a man who has just run through a covert extraction in service of the woman he rejected and the archives that document his empire's crimes, and is very clear-eyed about what that means for every subsequent decision he will make. "Why did you come back for me?" she said. The question was not what it sounded like on its surface. It was not asking about the physical action of the last 4 minutes. It was asking the older question, the one underneath all the others, the one that had been sitting in the space between them since a corridor in the palace and a road east and 23 days of mountains and an archive and a ward dropping from the inside. He looked at her. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "And mistakes have a cost. I don't get to decide what the cost is." He held her gaze. "I only get to decide whether I pay it." Mira was moving. "We need to go. Now." Elira turned. She led them out. The exit brought them to the mountain's north face, a path that was less a path than a negotiation with gravity, narrow and cold and entirely invisible from below. Draven followed with the sealed case under his arm and the wind in his face and the sound of the extraction team breaching the archive room behind them, shouting as they found the shelves half empty. They moved up. The mountain received them with indifference. Elira moved ahead of all of them, and the shadows on the path moved with her. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical force of a woman who had decided to demonstrate power, but with the quiet functionality of authority that has learned it doesn't need to announce itself. The path was dark. Where she walked, the dark was navigable. Draven watched this and said nothing. At the second ridge, Mira stopped and turned back to look at the fortress below. "They'll have it within the hour," she said. "Whatever we left, they'll take." "Let them take it," Elira said. She was looking ahead, at the mountain above them, at the darkness that the path continued into. Documents are evidence. Evidence requires an authority willing to act on it. She shifted the weight of the archive in her arms. "We don't need the documents to prove what the Empire did. We need an Empire willing to look at what it did." She glanced back at Draven. "That's a different problem." He met her eyes over the cold mountain air. "It is," he said. "Are you still the Empire?" she said. The question had no comfortable answer. He was aware of this. He had built his life around the identification and management of questions with no comfortable answer. But managing an uncomfortable question was not the same as answering it, and the difference mattered here. He looked at the fortress below, where his council's extraction team was moving through rooms, taking and destroying, operating under the authority of the institution he had built his entire identity around protecting. He looked at the sealed case in his arms. He looked at Elira. "I'm the man who built it," he said. "And I'm the man who has to decide what that means now that I know what it was built on." He paused. "That might be the same thing as your question, or it might not be. I don't know yet." She looked at him for a long moment, then she turned and kept climbing. He followed. Below them, the fortress of Nocthir burned. Not all of it. The stone would not catch, and the Covenant's people had made choices about what was irreplaceable and what was merely significant. But the archive room burned, and the orange light of it climbed the mountain behind them as they moved, and Draven climbed with the documentation of his empire's crimes under his arm, and the woman his empire had rejected, moving ahead of him up a mountain path that darkness obeyed like a command. He understood, climbing, what the council's decision actually meant. They had made him an exile. He had left the capital as an emperor conducting an authorized assessment. He would not be permitted to return as that. He would return, if he returned, as something the council would already have begun the process of redefining. A compromised figure, a man whose judgment had been found wanting, a ruler whose proximity to enemy influence had rendered his decision suspect, They would have the narrative drafted by morning. They would have the institutional apparatus moving before he got off the mountain. An alpha who loses the machinery of his authority has only two assets remaining: the truth of what he knows, and the willingness to use it. He climbed. Ahead of him, Elira reached the ridge and stopped and looked out at the mountain range spreading east and north, at the territory that the Empire had called abandoned, and that was simply, it turned out, waiting. The orange light from below caught the side of her face and the set of her jaw, and the shadow-stilled air around her that attended her like a court that required no hall. She said without turning, "The Covenant has 3 other locations. Castor knows the routes." She paused. "We regroup. We assess what we have. We plan from that." "We," Draven said. She turned then. She looked at him with the full weight of everything, of the bond and the haul and the rejection and the 23 days of excavation and one night on a mountain path carrying evidence of crimes with his council's men below them burning the archive. "Don't read anything into it," she said. "We is a tactical designation." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, and in it was everything that could not be said yet, everything that the situation had not yet earned the right to name, everything that 2 people carry when the bond between them has been through fire and still exists in some form neither of them has vocabulary for. Then she turned east. "Keep up," she said. He kept up. Behind them, the light from the burning archive climbed until it was visible from the valley below, where the Empire's soldiers looked up at the mountain and saw it. And far away, in the capital, in the room where 12 men had spent the evening deciding that the truth was a manageable problem, the High Council of Valdrake received the first message from the extraction team. The message said, "Target secured, archive neutralized, Emperor's location unknown." The council read it. One of them said, "Find him." Another said, "What do we tell the court?" The oldest of them, the one who had served 4 emperors and understood power the way a stone understands water, by having been shaped by it for long enough that the shaping was indistinguishable from nature, looked at the message for a long moment. Then he said, "We tell them the Emperor is recovering from an illness. We have perhaps 2 weeks before that stops working." He looked around the table. "In 2 weeks, I want options." The options he was describing were not diplomatic. He folded the message, he set it on the table, and the Empire, which had spent 400 years deciding that the truth was a manageable problem, began the process of discovering what happens when the truth acquires an army. Above the burning archive, on the ridge of a mountain, the Empire had written off its maps. 2 sovereigns walked east together into the dark. Neither of them had chosen this. Both of them had arrived here by the only route available to people who decide, at the last possible moment, that the truth is worth more than the position they've built on top of the lie. The darkness ahead was not empty. It was waiting, and what it was waiting for was not the emperor who had built an empire on a stolen crown, or the archivist who had survived 6 years of invisibility, or even the sovereign regent who had spent 23 days excavating what she was. It was waiting for what 2 people become when the thing that broke them is the same thing that shows them what they are actually made of. That answer was still being written, but the direction was set, and the empire behind them had no idea what it had just finished building by burning what it could not control. They walked for 6 hours before stopping, not because anyone had decided 6 hours was the right number, because Castor's legs gave out on the 4th ridge and nobody said anything about it, just waited while he caught his breath and recalibrated. And then Mira looked at the sky and the position of what stars were visible through the cloud cover and said they were 3 hours from the second Covenant location if they pushed, but the path after the next descent required daylight to navigate safely. The choice was push and risk the path, or stop and rest and move at first light. Elira made the call without deliberating. "We stop," she said. They found a rock overhang wide enough for 5 people and deep enough to block the wind. Castor and one of the 2 Covenant members, a young man named Dort, who had not said a single word since the fortress, and whose silence had the quality of someone processing rather than someone empty, arranged what they'd carried into a workable camp. No fire. The orange light from the burning archive was still visible to the southwest, which meant the extraction team's position was visible too. And visible light invites visible attention. They sat in cold and dark. Kael was with them. He'd come through the secondary passage 30 seconds behind Draven, moving on one leg with the furious efficiency of a man who had decided that the injury to his other one was a detail he'd address later. His left knee was wrong in a way that Draven could see from how he positioned himself against the rock, but Kael's face said nothing about it, and Draven understood that to acknowledge it would be to create a problem where Kael had chosen not to have one. Sela was not with them. This was the thing Draven had not yet addressed aloud, and had not addressed because there was a difference between not knowing what happened to someone and knowing but being unable to yet say it in a way that served any purpose. Sela Vane had been his intelligence director for 6 years. She had been secured, the extraction team leader had said. Secured was a word that could mean many things, and in the experience of a man who had used institutional language as a management tool for his entire reign, the range of meanings attached to the word secured was wide enough to accommodate everything from alive and detained to something else entirely. He sat against the rock. He looked at his hands in the dark. He thought about the last 6 years of Sela's reports, assembled with the precision of someone who understood that the quality of information was directly proportional to the quality of the decisions it enabled. He thought about the way she had said that morning in his office a lifetime ago, "I anticipated that." The preemptive assembly of relevant documentation, the professional's reflex of thinking one step ahead. He thought about whether she had anticipated this. He did not know. Not knowing was the weight he would carry until he knew. "You're thinking about Vane," Elira said. She was sitting 4 feet to his left, her back against the same rock face, the sealed archive case between her feet. Her voice was quiet and had the flatness of someone making a factual observation rather than opening a conversation. "Yes," he said. She knew the risk. "That doesn't change what the risk cost." A pause. "No," she said. "It doesn't." The silence after that was a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. Not comfortable. Nothing about the situation earned comfort, but less defended. The kind of silence that two people fall into when they have stopped performing their positions at each other and have arrived at the simpler, colder reality of shared circumstance. "Why did your council move tonight?" she said. He looked at the sky above the overhang. "Because I went east without asking permission, which told them my judgment was no longer predictable." Unpredictable emperors are the council's greatest institutional fear. They have spent 3 decades building influence on the assumption that the man at the top of the structure makes decisions in a range they can anticipate and manage. He paused. "I left the range. By coming here. He was quiet for a moment. "And by reading what I read. Once you've read those documents, every subsequent decision you make is different. They knew that. They calculated that the cost of letting me read them was higher than the cost of the action they took." He looked at the orange glow to the southwest. "They weren't wrong about the calculation. They were wrong about which cost was acceptable." Elira was quiet, looking at the same glow. "Do you know what strikes me," she said, "about men who build empires on lies? Tell me." "They always believe the lie is the foundation, the thing doing the structural work." She shifted against the rock. "But the lie isn't load-bearing. The lie is insulation. What's actually load-bearing is the willingness of everyone inside the structure to keep not asking the question." She looked at him. "Your council didn't move tonight because the documents are dangerous. They moved tonight because you read them, because the man at the top of the structure stopped not asking the question." He held her gaze. "And now," she said, "every person below him has to decide whether they keep not asking." He said nothing for a moment, then, "You've been thinking about this for 23 days. "I've been thinking about this for 6 years, she said. 23 days I've been thinking about what to do with it." The second Covenant location was a farmhouse. This was not a tactical understatement. It was an actual farmhouse, 2 stories, stone foundation situated in a valley that the Empire's maps labeled as low-value agricultural territory, and which was, in practice, one of 36 properties the Covenant had established over the past century as assets that operated in plain sight. The farmer who nominally owned it was a Covenant member. The farm produced actual crops. The second floor contained a communications apparatus that had been quietly maintaining contact between the surviving Nocthur lineage networks for 40 years. They arrived at mid-morning. Draven had not slept. This was not unusual for him. His military career had required the ability to operate on no sleep as a baseline functional capacity, and the years of ruling had not softened that. What was unusual was the specific quality of wakefulness he carried into the farmhouse, the alertness of a man who has not slept because his mind is doing something that requires consciousness and cannot be interrupted. He was rebuilding, not the empire. He was not at this point in a position to rebuild anything larger than his immediate understanding of his situation. He was rebuilding his model of the last 15 years of decision-making, retrofitting every major choice through the lens of what he now knew about what those choices had been made in service of. The philosophy he had built, love secures nothing, fear secures everything, had seemed for 15 years to be empirically supported. The empire was stable. The borders held. The houses obeyed. What the stability had actually been, he was understanding now, was not the product of his philosophy. It was the product of a structure built on concealed history. He had been governing a lie and calling the lie's durability proof of his principles. The two things were not the same. He sat at the farmhouse table and Castor spread what maps he'd salvaged, and Mira began the process of contacting the lineage networks. And Draven watched Elira across the table and understood that what she had spent 23 days building was not an army. It was an argument, the most dangerous kind, one with evidence. "How many networks?" he said. Castor looked up. "Active contacts in 9 of the 12 border territories. 3 noble houses inside the Empire proper who have been carrying Covenant-affiliated lineages for 2 generations without knowing the full context of what they're affiliated with." He smoothed a map. 2 garrison commanders who have been questioning imperial succession law quietly enough that the council hasn't noticed. He paused. "And perhaps 400 people in the eastern territories who have been waiting for exactly this." 400 people, Draven said. "Is not an army," Mira said, without looking up from the communication apparatus. "We know, it was never supposed to be." "What was it supposed to be?" Elira looked at him from across the table. "A court," she said, "a legitimate assembly of people who represent the lineages the Empire erased, enough to constitute a legal body capable of making a claim." She held his gaze. "Not a military claim, a historical one." He looked at her. "You were going to take the Empire to court," he said. "I was going to present the Empire with a historical accounting it could not dismiss as enemy propaganda, delivered by an assembly of people with standing to deliver it, backed by documentation that predates the Empire's own founding records." She was very calm. "Yes. Without an army fighting an empire loses eventually. The Empire has more armies. The Empire has always had more armies." She looked at the map on the table. But an empire fighting its own documented history, an empire being asked to look at what it actually is in front of its own people, that's a different kind of battle. And it's one the Empire has no established strategy for, because it has never had to fight it. Draven sat with this for a moment. He thought about what his council had done. The extraction team, the burning archive, the institutional machinery of suppression moving with the practiced efficiency of a structure that had performed this function before. Because it had. The erasure itself was this machinery at scale. His council hadn't invented the response. They had inherited it, along with everything else. "The documents," he said, what we carried out. "Enough," Elira said. "The founding massacre records. The original bloodline registry. The Covenant of Dominance original draft with its margin annotations. The ones where your great-great-grandfather's advisors noted, in their own handwriting, which parts of the peaceful unification narrative were fabricated and why." She paused. "The annotated draft alone, authenticated and presented in front of a legitimate assembly, undoes 4 centuries of institutional mythology." Draven said nothing. The farmhouse was quiet, except for the sound of Mira working the communications apparatus. Then Dort, who had not spoken since the fortress, said from his position near the door, "Someone's coming up the valley road." The word arriving was not the extraction team. It was worse and better simultaneously in the specific way that unexpected developments tend to be when you are already operating at the outer edge of manageable complexity. It was a rider, one alone, moving fast from the direction of the Empire, with the body language of someone who has been riding hard enough that the horse's distress is secondary to the urgency of the destination. Kael was at the door before the rider reached the gate. Draven was behind him. The rider pulled up and dropped from the saddle and was, under the trail dust and exhaustion, a young man of perhaps 22 with the courier insignia of the imperial military on his collar and an expression that contained the particular combination of relief and terror that belongs to a person who has made it to the right place and is not certain what happens to them now. "Who sent you?" Draven said. The young man looked at him, looked at the Emperor of Valdrake standing in the yard of a farmhouse in the Eastern Territories in traveling clothes with no retinue, and swallowed once. "Commander Vane," he said. Draven went very still. "She's alive," he said. Not a question. A recalibration. "Detained in the capital, sire. Council house arrest, not she's alive." The writer reached into his coat and produced a sealed message. "She got this out through a contact in the courier network. She said to tell you—" He hesitated. "Tell me." "She said to tell you the council voted this morning. Formal declaration that the Emperor's capacity to rule is compromised pending medical evaluation." He said this with the flatness of a man reciting something he doesn't entirely believe. "They've called a succession council for the end of the month." The word succession moved through the group like a cold front. A succession council was the Empire's oldest institutional mechanism, older than the current dynasty, older than the Kaelor line itself, predating even the events the founding documents had rewritten. It was the assembly of the 12 High Lords with the authority to confirm or remove a ruling emperor on the grounds of incapacity if the council invoked the procedure. They were going to replace him on a timeline of 30 days. And in 30 days, if the succession council met and the High Lords voted, as they would vote, because the High Lords had been managed and pressured and aligned by the council for years, the Empire would have a new ruling authority, one the council controlled completely, and the question of Noctur's historical claim would be dealt with using the same method that had dealt with it 400 years ago. Draven took the message. He read it. He read it twice. Then he looked at Elira, who had come to the farmhouse door and was watching him with the flat attention of someone who has already calculated what the information means before she received it. 30 days, he said. "I heard," she said. "Your assembly, your historical claim. How long to constitute the legitimate court?" She looked at him. "If the networks respond," she said carefully. "And if we move now? 3 weeks. Maybe less." "Maybe less," he said. "Why?" He looked at the sealed message in his hand. At Sella's handwriting on the outer seal. Neat, precise. The handwriting of a woman who had been detained and had found a way to work around it because that was what she did. Because that was who she was. He looked at the farmhouse. At Castor and Mira and Dort and the young courier and Kael with his damaged knee that he was treating as a non-issue. At the map on the table inside and the communications apparatus and 400 people in the Eastern Territories who had been waiting for exactly this. He looked at Elira. "Because 30 days is how long we have before the Empire replaces me with something it controls completely, at which point your historical claim goes from a legal argument to a military conflict, and a military conflict against the full resource capacity of Valdrake is not a fight 400 people can win." He held her gaze. "But a legal argument delivered by a legitimate assembly to the High Lords before the Succession Council meets, delivered with documentation that the Council cannot suppress because it's already been witnessed, already been read, already been presented in front of people with standing. That is a different thing." She was very still. "You want to go back," she said. "I want to take the argument back," he said, "which requires you, which requires the assembly, which requires the documentation we carried off the mountain." He paused. "And it requires me to walk into the capital and stand in front of the High Lords and say what I read, as the Emperor, while I'm still the Emperor." The silence that followed was not the silence of a situation being considered. It was the silence of a situation that has just revealed its shape. Here is what an alpha looks like when he has stopped having anything left to protect except the truth. It is not comfortable to watch, and it is not heroic in the clean, mythologized way of stories that prefer their courage decorative. It is a man standing in a farmhouse yard with trail dust on his boots, and a message from a detained intelligence director in his hand, making the calculation of a person who understands exactly what he is walking into and is choosing to walk into it anyway, because the alternative is letting something worse happen, and he has arrived at the point where worse is not acceptable. This is the thing that power rarely teaches its practitioners. The moment when the machinery of position fails, when the council moves and the apparatus turns, and the institutional weight of everything you built realigns against you, what remains is not the crown, and not the title, and not the 15 years of correct decisions. What remains is the person you actually are. Draven had spent 15 years not being certain what that was, because the machinery had been doing so much of the load-bearing. He was certain now. "We move in 3 days," he said. 2 to gather the network contacts Castor can reach in time. 1 to plan the approach. He looked at Elira. "The Assembly presents the historical claim. I provide the imperial authentication, my testimony, my presence, my standing as the ruling emperor before the succession council strips it." He paused. "It's the only combination that works. Your claim without my authentication is enemy propaganda. My authentication without your claim is just a man admitting his empire was wrong with no legal mechanism to act on it." Elira looked at him for a long time. The farmhouse yard was very quiet. A wind came down from the mountains and moved through the tall grass of the valley with a sound like an intake of breath. "You understand," she said, "that if this works, if the High Lords hear the claim and the documentation and your testimony and they move against the council, the empire you walk back into is not the empire you left. No. The Kaelor dynasty's legitimacy is contingent on a founding document we can prove is fabricated. Any resolution that involves truth requires a reckoning with that." "Yes. You could lose the throne entirely." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. She studied him. This was the thing she had not calculated, had not permitted herself to calculate, because calculating it required treating his choices as real choices rather than strategic maneuvers, and treating his choices as real required a degree of trust she had not been ready to extend. She had spent 23 days building toward something she could control, something that did not require anyone else's decision to go the right way. And here he was, making a decision she could not control, making it for reasons she could not dismiss as political calculation because the politics ran in the opposite direction, because the politically intelligent choice for an emperor facing a council revolt and a succession council was not to align himself with the historical claim of the lineage his empire had erased. The politically intelligent choice was to negotiate, contain, and manage. He was not doing the politically intelligent thing. She recognized this. She had spent 6 years cataloging every decision the political apparatus of Valdrake made, and why. And she recognized what a decision that ran against political intelligence looked like. It looked like this. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She turned and went back inside. He stood in the yard for another moment, alone, looking at the message from Selah and the map of what had to happen next, and the 3 weeks between the farmhouse and the capital and the succession council and everything that would not survive the encounter intact. An empire, a dynasty, a philosophy built on 15 years of deciding that sentiment was weakness. The price of getting it wrong for 15 years was not paid all at once. That was the thing no one told you about the cost of incorrect foundations. The cost accumulated quietly, invisibly, behind the walls of the structure that appeared solid from outside, until one day the foundation shifted and the cost became visible all at once, and the number was large enough to reorder everything. He had run an empire on the principle that correct decisions could be defended by their outcomes. The outcome of his most consequential decision was standing inside a farmhouse holding a sealed archive case and moving toward the capital with 400 people in 30 days, and the specific dangerous clarity of a woman who had discovered that the power denied her by others had always been hers. He could not call that correct, but he could still decide what to do with it. He went inside. The 3 days moved with the compressed intensity of time that is simultaneously too short and exactly right. Castor worked the network contacts with the focused urgency of a man who had been waiting 40 years to make these calls and was not going to waste the opportunity on anything less than complete effort. By the end of the first day, 22 people had confirmed. By the end of the second, 67. By the morning of the third, 114. A combination of lineage representatives, territorial leaders, garrison commanders, and 3 noble house representatives who had been carrying the question quietly for years, and answered the summons with the relief of people finally permitted to stop pretending. Not 400, 114. It would have to be enough. Elira spent those 3 days in a different kind of preparation. Not logistics. Mira and Castor had logistics. She spent them doing the thing that the archive had taught her was the final and most difficult component of what she carried. Not the shadow dominion, not the authority, but the specific capacity of a sovereign regent to stand before an assembled body and make what the old tongue called a speaking of truth, an address that operated not on argument or evidence but on the older mechanism, the one that required the blood to be fully active and the speaker to have moved entirely past the performance of conviction into conviction itself. It could not be faked. This was the critical thing Mira had told her. On the second night, sitting in the farmhouse kitchen with the maps put away and the networks confirmed and the quiet of a situation that had been as prepared as it could be. The speaking only works if you're not performing it, Mira said. Your ancestors understood this. The historical record of failed sovereign addresses is entirely composed of cases where the sovereign was trying to convince rather than simply being. The dominion doesn't amplify persuasion, it amplifies truth. She looked at Elira across the table, which means it amplifies whatever is actually in you when you speak. If there is unresolved, if there are things you haven't moved through, tell me what you're asking, Elira said. I'm asking about him. Mira's voice was even. Because you're going to stand in front of an imperial assembly and call a reckoning on a dynasty. And the man who built that dynasty in its current form is going to be standing beside you. And the bond between you is what it is, which is unresolved. A pause. The dominion will reflect whatever is actually true in you in that moment. If what is true is rage, that is what will amplify. If what is true is grief, that is what will amplify. If what is true is something more complicated, then that is what will amplify, Elira said. Yes. She sat with this. The kitchen fire was low. What do you need? Mira said. Elira looked at the table, at her hands, at the ink that had never fully washed out of the skin around her knuckles from 6 years of archival work that had looked like service and had actually been survival. I need to have one honest conversation, she said. Before we walk into the capital. Mira nodded once. She left. Draven came in from the yard 10 minutes later and found Elira at the kitchen table. He read the room with the automatic efficiency of a man trained to read rooms and sat across from her without being asked. He waited. I need to say something to you, she said. That is not tactical, and that is not going to be comfortable. Go ahead. You rejected me in front of 10,000 people, she said, and I know why. And I understand the calculation, and I have spent 30 days building something out of the consequence of that moment that is larger and more significant than anything I would have built if the moment hadn't happened. She met his eyes. I am not going to tell you I'm grateful for it. I am not going to perform a forgiveness I have not yet completed. But I am going to tell you that I understand now what it cost you to do it, not what you told yourself it cost you, what it actually cost. He said nothing. The bond, she said. What the bond carries. I can feel the shape of what you suppressed in the hall, not the decision, the thing underneath the decision. The 3 seconds before you looked away. She held his gaze with the flat steadiness that was the face of a woman who has excavated herself down to bedrock and is speaking from there. I know what was in those 3 seconds. His jaw tightened slightly. Say what you need to say, he said. His voice was quiet. I need to go into that assembly without carrying this as a wound, she said, because the speaking requires truth, and the truth is complicated, and I cannot have it complicated by something I haven't named. Bullspit. She paused. So I'm naming it. You saw me. You recognized what I was. You turned away because the crown required it, and it has cost you every day since in ways you have filed under strategic override and not looked at. She paused again. That is what happened. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm stating it, because stating it is what I need in order to go into that hall and do what needs to be done without carrying it incorrectly. But Draven looked at her across the kitchen table for a long time. Then he said, it cost more than any decision I've made in 15 years. And I made it anyway. And it produced this. He held her gaze. I don't know how to account for that. I don't have a framework for a decision that was correct and wrong simultaneously. It wasn't correct, she said. It was strategic. They're not the same word. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. They're not. The fire was very low. When this is over, he said, I want to have the rest of this conversation, not the tactical part, the rest. She looked at him for a moment. We'll see what survives, she said. She stood. She went to the door. She stopped. Draven, she said. He looked at her. In the hall, she said. The 3 seconds. He waited. I felt it too, she said. She went out. He sat in the kitchen for a long time after, with the low fire and the maps on the table and the weight of 3 seconds that had been carrying this entire story from the beginning. They left at dawn. 114 people moving east to west. A column that was not an army and was not a crowd, but was something in between, something that had the specific quality of people who have decided to stop carrying their knowledge privately and are moving toward the moment when they put it down in a public place and let it be what it is. Draven rode at the column's center. Elira rode at the front. The sealed archive case was in the wagon behind her, wrapped in oilcloth, containing the annotated founding document and the massacre records and the bloodline registry and everything that 400 years of institutional suppression had failed to destroy. They rode for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, the capital's walls appeared on the horizon. Obsidian towers in early light, dragon banners moving in the wind, the silhouette of the palace rising above everything else the way it had always risen, the way power presents itself to the landscape it has decided to own. Draven looked at it from the column's center with the specific feeling of a man returning to a place that is no longer what it was when he left. The city had been his for 15 years. He was riding back to it with the woman he had rejected and the documentation of his empire's crimes and 114 witnesses, and somewhere inside those walls his council was preparing a succession council and a narrative about medical incapacity, and the High Lords were being managed and pressured, and the machinery of suppression was running at full capacity. And at the front of the column, Elira pulled her horse to a stop at the crest of the last hill before the descent to the Capitol Road. She looked at the city for a long moment, then she looked at him. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has moved all the way through grief and fury and the patient slow burn of a forge and arrived at something on the other side that does not have a comfortable name but is harder than all of them. No turning back, she said. No, he said. Whatever the High Lords decide, whatever they decide, he confirmed. She looked at him one more time. Then she turned to the column. 114 people looked at her on the hill above the capital of the empire that had erased her lineage and rejected her bond and burned her archive and spent 400 years deciding that the truth was a manageable problem. She opened her mouth. And the shadows around her, mountain shadows, road shadows, the long shadows of the early morning light hitting the hill at a low angle, moved. Not dramatically, not as performance, as attendance, as the specific orientation of something very old toward the person who carries the authority to direct it. She spoke. She said, in a voice that was not raised, that did not require volume because it operated on a frequency below volume, that carried the full weight of the sovereign blood fully active for the first time in the light of day in front of witnesses. We go in together. We put the truth down in front of them, and we let it be what it is. 114 people looked at her. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Dort, who had not said a word since the fortress, said, "Together." And the column moved, and inside the capital, in the palace, in the room where 12 men had spent 30 days building the architecture of a lie's defense, someone at the window looked up from their work and said, "Something's coming up the Capitol Road." The council member who had been drafting the succession council's language looked up. He looked at the window. He set down his pen. "How many?" he said. A pause. "More than we planned for," the man at the window said. The pen stayed on the desk. The council member stood. He looked at the door. He looked at the window. He looked at the document he had been drafting, the careful institutional language of a power structure defending itself against accountability with the only tools such structures know how to use. And then, from somewhere outside, through the walls of the palace, and the obsidian towers and the stone that had been built to make people feel small, something moved. Not wind, not sound, something older, something that had been suppressed for 400 years and was done being suppressed. The shadows in the council room shifted, every one of them, simultaneously, toward the window, toward the road, toward her. The council member took one step back, and the door to the council room opened, and Draven Kalor walked in. Still the Emperor. For now. The council room went very quiet, not the quiet of absence. Every man in it was present, breathing, processing. The quiet of a room that has just understood that the situation it had been managing has become, in the space between one breath and the next, something it has never managed before. 12 men who had spent 30 days constructing the institutional language of an emperor's removal looked at the emperor standing in the doorway and performed, each of them, the same rapid recalculation. He was here. He was standing. He was looking at them with the specific quality of attention that belongs to a man who knows exactly what he walked into and walked in anyway. The eldest council member, Lord Harvin Cray, 68 years of institutional authority, built across 4 reigns, the man whose pen had been drafting the succession council language, looked at Draven with the face of someone who has made a decision and is not yet certain whether it was the right one and cannot afford to show that uncertainty. "Sire," he said. The word was careful, positioned. It acknowledged the title without committing to its continued validity. "Harvin," Draven said. Not Lord, not the formal address, the name stripped of title, which told everyone in the room exactly where this conversation was positioned. He walked in. He did not wait for invitation. He walked to the head of the council table, his table, the table he had sat at the head of for 15 years, and he put both hands flat on the wood and looked at the 12 men assembled around it. "You drafted a succession council declaration," he said. Cray held his position. "The council acted in the Empire's best interest during a period of don't." The word was not loud. It did not need to be. "I've read the founding archive. I've read the original Covenant of Dominance with the margin annotations. I know what the Empire is built on, and I know what you've spent 30 years helping it remain built on. And I know that everything you've done since I rode east has been about keeping that foundation from public examination." He looked at Cray directly. "So don't give me the institutional language. I don't have patience for it today." The room was very still. Cray looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the quieter, more honest voice of a man who has decided that performance is no longer available to him, "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to give you a choice," Draven said. "The same choice I have been making for the past 3 days. Which is this. The truth is in the Capitol. It came through the gates this morning with 114 witnesses and documentation that your extraction team failed to destroy. You can spend the next 30 days using the succession council mechanism to put a compliant replacement on this throne and attempt to suppress it again." He paused. "Or you can be in the room when it's presented, as the council, with the standing that gives you, and you can choose what that standing gets used for." He let that sit. The 12 men looked at each other. This is the moment that power structures dread above all others. Not the approach of an enemy, not the failure of a military campaign, not even the loss of territory or resources. Those things have established responses. Established responses are the load-bearing infrastructure of institutional authority. What power structures cannot survive is the removal of the choice between suppression and engagement, because suppression is the only tool they have been built to use. And when suppression has failed, what remains is engagement, and engagement with truth requires a form of honesty that institutions are almost constitutionally incapable of. Almost. Lord Cray set down his pen. He looked at it on the table for a moment. Then he looked at Draven. "Show us the documentation," he said. Elara came into the council room 20 minutes later. She came alone. Mira had offered to accompany her, and she had declined because the speaking required her to enter that room as herself. Not as the head of a delegation, not as the representative of an organization, but as the specific person she had become through everything she had been through, and that person did not need a guard. She carried the sealed case. She set it on the council table. She looked at the 12 men, and she looked at Draven standing at the head of the table, and she opened the case and laid the documents out in order. The Founding Massacre records first, the Bloodline Registry second, the Annotated Covenant of Dominance last. With the precise, unhurried movements of an archivist who has been handling irreplaceable documents her entire working life, and understands that the manner of presentation is part of the presentation. Nobody spoke while she laid them out. When she was finished, she stepped back from the table and stood at the room's edge and said, "These are authenticated primary source documents from the pre-imperial period. The authentication methodology is documented in the accompanying archive materials, which are currently held by 114 witnesses assembled in the Hall of Records on the palace's eastern wing. The witnesses include representatives of 9 border territories, 3 imperial noble houses, and 2 active garrison commanders. Their presence constitutes a legal assembly under the Old Covenant law that predates the Kaelor dynasty's founding documents." She held the room's attention with the flat, absolute steadiness of a woman who has moved all the way to the other side of fear. "The assembly is convened in the name of the Nocthyr sovereign lineage, of which I am the direct descendant heir. The claim before this council is not military. It is historical. And it is asking this council to look at what it has been administering and decide what it wants to be going forward." Dun-dun. Lord Cray looked at the annotated covenant on the table. He reached forward and picked it up. He read the margin annotations, the handwritten notes from the first Kaelor Emperor's advisors, noting which parts of the peaceful unification narrative had been constructed, and why, noting the names of the 12 shadow sovereigns killed at the summit, noting the disposal of the original bloodline registries that the public covenant had replaced. He read for a long time. The other 11 men were reading the other documents, passing them between each other with the careful handling of people who understand that what they are touching is not just paper. The room was quiet for a very long time. Then Lord Cray set the annotated covenant down. He looked at Draven. "You've read all of this," he said. "Yes," Draven said. "And your assessment?" Draven looked at the document on the table, at his great-great-grandfather's advisor's handwriting in the margins, at the careful institutional language of a fabrication constructed to replace a truth that inconvenient people had been killed to remove. "My assessment," he said, "is that this dynasty has been governing on a stolen legitimacy for 400 years. That the people in this room have been administering that governance, that the choice of what to do with that fact belongs to everyone in this room, including me." He paused. "And that the choice the council made 30 days ago, the extraction, the archive fire, the succession council declaration, was the wrong one. And I'm asking you to make a different choice now." Cray looked at him for a very long time. "What does the different choice look like?" he said. Draven looked at Elira. She held his gaze. "It looks like this council convening the High Lords," he said. "All 12 of them, with the assembly present, with the documentation authenticated and witnessed. And it looks like an official imperial acknowledgement, not a private concession, not an administrative reclassification, but a public documented permanent acknowledgement of the historical record, of what the founding actually was, of what was destroyed to build what we have." He paused. "And it looks like a new covenant between the Empire of Valdrake and the Nocthyr lineage that reflects the actual history rather than the constructed one." The word covenant moved through the room. "And the Succession Council declaration," Cray said. "Withdrawn," Draven said, "by the council's own authority, today." Another silence. Cray looked around the table. At 11 men who had built their lives and their influence on the foundation that was currently being asked to acknowledge itself as constructed. Some of them looked at the documents. Some looked at the table. One, the youngest of the 12, a man named Belloc, who had been on the council for 3 years and whose presence Draven had always read as representing the next generation of the institution's thinking, was looking at Elira with an expression that was not resentment and was not fear. It was, Draven thought, something closer to relief. "Call the High Lords," Cray said. The assembly convened that afternoon in the Hall of Records, which was the largest space in the palace that was not designed for ceremony, which was exactly the point. Ceremony creates distance. Ceremony wraps the business of power in the language of inevitability, suggesting that what is happening has always been happening and will always happen, and that the people in the room are not so much deciding as participating in a process larger than decision. This was not that. This was 114 people and 12 council members and 12 High Lords in a room with a table and documents and fluorescent winter light through tall windows, doing the most difficult thing that any power structure has ever been asked to do: looking at itself. Alira spoke for 40 minutes. She did not perform it. This was the thing that Mira had told her, that the speaking could not be a performance, and it was not. She stood at the front of the room and spoke in the voice of a woman who had spent 6 years invisible and 23 days excavating and 30 more days moving through fire. And what came out was not rhetoric and was not argument. It was the record. She presented the massacre, the names of the 12 rulers, the summit they had attended in good faith, and what had happened to them there. The military campaign that had followed, the fabrication of the founding documents, the deliberate erasure of the lineages that survived. She presented it the way an archivist presents a finding, with precision, with documentation, with the flat, unsparing honesty of someone who has decided that the record matters more than any particular audience's comfort. And as she spoke, the shadows in the Hall of Records, the long afternoon shadows of tall windows in winter, the shadows of the assembled people, the deep shadows of the hall's unlit corners, moved. Slowly, toward her. Not dramatically. Nobody screamed, nobody pointed. But the people in the room felt it, the shift in the room's ambient quality, the specific sensation of being in the presence of something that operated on a frequency below ordinary experience, the feeling of a truth being spoken that was not just language but was older than language, was the kind of truth that exists in the bone and the blood before it exists in the word. The High Lord sat very still. The council members sat very still. 114 witnesses sat very still. And when she finished speaking, the room was the quietest it had ever been. Then Draven stood. He did not speak for as long as she had. He did not have as much to say because his part of the truth was simpler and harder simultaneously. The truth of a man who had inherited something without knowing its full cost, and who had spent 15 years governing it with genuine conviction and genuine skill, and who had arrived at the moment of reckoning with the specific burden of a person who cannot claim ignorance as innocence. "I am not going to ask this assembly to believe that I didn't know, Kies," he said. "You can decide that for yourselves. What I'm going to tell you is what I know now, and what I intend to do with it." He looked at the High Lords. The Kaelor dynasty's founding document is fabricated. The actual history is what you have just heard. That history does not disappear because it is inconvenient. It does not become less true because 400 years of institutional authority have been built on top of it. He paused. What it requires is not the destruction of everything built on it. What it requires is the acknowledgement that gives the people who were erased their standing back, their names, their place in the record. He looked at the documentation on the table, and a new agreement between what this empire is and what it should be. He looked at Elira. She held his gaze. "The Nocthur lineage is real," he said. "Its claim is legitimate, and the Empire of Valdrake, under my authority as its emperor, for as long as I remain its emperor, acknowledges both." The silence after held for a long moment. Then Lord Belloc, the youngest of the council members, said, "I move to withdraw the Succession Council declaration." A pause. "Seconded," said another voice, and the room, incrementally, began to move. The acknowledgement was not clean. This is the truth about reckonings that stories tend to spare their audiences, because clean endings are more comfortable, and comfort is easier to sit with than the real texture of how power corrects itself, which is grudgingly and incompletely, and with the persistent resistance of people whose interests are served by incompleteness. The High Lords argued for 3 hours. 2 of them voted against the acknowledgement in its strongest form. The council negotiations over the language of the new covenant took 4 days and produced a document that satisfied nobody completely, which Mira said was the sign of a genuine agreement rather than a capitulation disguised as one. Alira accepted the agreement, not because it was everything, because it was documented, witnessed, permanent, because the names of the 12 murdered rulers were entered into the official imperial record with their correct titles and their correct history, because the bloodline registry was acknowledged as the authentic document and the fabricated covenant of dominance was reclassified in the public record as a secondary document of disputed authenticity, because Nocthur was recognized as a sovereign territory with standing under the new covenant, and because all of this existed now in the same archive system that had spent 6 years being maintained by a quiet woman in Archivist Gray, who had understood, always, that the archive was where power lived or died. She sat in the Hall of Records on the 5th evening, after the last session of negotiations, when the hall was empty except for Mira and Castor and the last of the documents being sealed and filed. She sat at the long table and looked at the room. This is what the story requires you to understand about power and its costs, because it would be dishonest to let the resolution sit only in its victories. The acknowledgement had come. The names were in the record. The lineage had standing. All of this was real, and all of this mattered, and none of it returned the 12 rulers who had been killed at a summit they had attended in good faith, or the generations of families who had lived in concealment, or the 6 years of a woman's life spent invisible in a palace that owed her a debt it had not known it was carrying. Truth does not undo what required it. This is the hardest lesson in the architecture of reckoning. We speak of truth as corrective, as the thing that, when finally acknowledged, sets the balance right. But truth does not set balances right. It sets records right. The balance, if it is to be righted at all, is a different project entirely, one that outlasts the reckoning and requires the sustained work of everyone who comes after it. And even then, completion is not guaranteed. What truth does, what it actually does, in the lived experience of people who fight for it, is make the continuation of the lie impossible. It closes off the option of pretending. It forces the situation into the territory where honest decisions are the only ones available. And that, which sounds small when described in those terms, is in fact the entire mechanism by which things change. Elira sat at the table. She thought about her grandmother's grandmother, who had been placed inside Valdrake as a survival measure during the erasure, who had lived an entire life inside the walls of the empire that had killed her people, concealing what she was with the specific courage of a person who understands that survival is not defeat. She thought about what she would tell her, if she could. She thought, it took a long time, and it cost everything, and the record is corrected now. She thought, I hope that is enough. She thought it was. Mira came and sat beside her. They were quiet together for a while, in the way of people who have been through something that doesn't require elaboration. What now? Mira said. Elira looked at the hall. Nocthar needs to be built, she said. Actually built. Not just acknowledged, it needs governance and infrastructure and people who can do the work of making a sovereign territory function. She paused. That is going to take years. Yes. And the imperial record needs ongoing oversight. Someone inside the archive system who can ensure that what was acknowledged today stays acknowledged, that the reclassifications hold, that the names stay in the record, that the institutional drift back toward comfortable fiction doesn't quietly undo what took 30 days to force. She looked at Mira. That is also going to take years. Also, yes, Mira looked at her. You're describing a life's work. I know. She was quiet for a moment. It turns out I'm good at that kind of work. Mira was quiet. Then she said carefully, and the other thing. Elira looked at the table. The other thing, she said. The bond, Mira said. Whatever it is now, whatever it became. Outside the hall, the palace was going about the business of an empire that has just undergone something significant and is in the process of deciding what to do with the aftermath. Voices in corridors, the sound of doors, the ordinary machinery of a large institution recalibrating. The bond, Elira said, is what it is. Which is, she looked at her hands, not what it was in the hall, she said. Not the thing I felt for 3 seconds in the ceremony. Not the thing I spent 23 days in the mountains trying not to think about. She paused. Something that came through fire and is still there. I don't have a clean name for it. I'm not sure it needs one. Mira was quiet. He asked about you, she said. This afternoon, after the final session. Elira looked at her. He asked if you were all right, Mira said. She was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him to ask you himself. She found him on the eastern terrace, which faced the mountains and the direction of everything that had happened. Standing with his hands on the stone railing and his back to the palace interior in the specific posture of a man who has finished the thing he came to do and is now in the difficult territory of the afterward. He heard her steps and turned. He looked the way a person looks after 5 days of the hardest thing they have ever done. Not broken, not diminished, but the kind of tired that sits in the eyes and the set of the jaw and the particular stillness of a body that has used everything it had and is not yet certain what replenishes. She came to stand beside him at the railing. They both looked at the mountains. The evening light was the specific gold of late winter, the kind that makes stone look like it was always meant to be exactly the color it is, and the Capitol below the terrace was quieter than it had been in the 5 days of the proceedings. "How's the knee?" she said. He looked at her with an expression that was, briefly and completely, surprised into honesty. "Kale's knee," she said. "I noticed he hasn't been walking normally." "He'll be fine," he said. "He won't discuss it." "Of course he won't." They were quiet for a moment. "Sela is out of council detention," he said. "Since yesterday morning, she's already reorganizing the intelligence apparatus to reflect the new covenant structure." A pause. "She told me that she anticipated this outcome." "Did she?" "She said she anticipated that I would make the right choice eventually. She said it always took me longer than it should, but I generally got there." He looked at the mountains. "She's not wrong." Alira was quiet. "Draven," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not staying in the capital. I know. Nocthur needs to be built. That's where I need to be." She looked at the mountains, at the direction of the eastern territories, at the long ridge where they had walked down in the dark with the archive under their arms and the burning fortress behind them. "The work I am is that work, not this." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said again. The evening light moved across the stone railing between their hands. "And the bond," she said. "What about it?" She looked at him directly. "It's not what the ceremony hall promised. That version ended the night you turned away. Whatever this is, whatever came through the last 30 days, it is not that original thing. I need you to understand that." She held his gaze. "I am not the woman who would have been your mate if you'd chosen differently in the hall. That person doesn't exist anymore. I am what happened after." He looked at her. His jaw was set, and his gray eyes had the quality they always had when he was sitting with something difficult, the quality of a man doing the work of honest reckoning rather than reaching for the easier answer. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for that." He paused. "I don't know what I'm asking for. I'm not certain this is the moment to ask." He looked at the mountains. "I know that whatever you are, whatever happened after, is someone I want to know. If that is something you're willing to consider at some point when the work has been done and the distance has been what it needs to be." She looked at him for a long time. This is the thing that the story has been building toward, underneath all of its architecture of power and reckoning and historical claim. The quieter question of what two people owe each other after they have been through the specific fire of betrayal and consequence, and the long, unglamorous work of accountability. The answer is not romance, because romance implies a softness that this situation has not earned, and these two people would not believe. The answer is not forgiveness as a gift, freely and cleanly given, because forgiveness of this kind is not given freely. It is built, incrementally, from the material of changed behavior and demonstrated honesty and time. The answer is something smaller and more durable than either of those things. The answer is, we'll see. "When the work is done," she said. He looked at her. "When the work is done," he said. She nodded once. She looked at the mountains for one more moment. Then she said, "I'm leaving tomorrow. Mira has the first network of Nocthur builders ready to move. Castor has the territorial maps. We have enough to start." "I know." "The oversight structure for the Imperial Archive. I've drafted the protocols. Belloc has agreed to champion them inside the Council. It will require ongoing pressure to make it hold, but it's a workable structure." "I'll make it hold," he said, "whatever pressure it requires." She looked at him. "I know," she said. And the thing she meant by that, the full weight of it, what it had cost her to arrive at the point where those 3 words were honest rather than hopeful, sat between them on the terrace in the evening light, and both of them understood it without requiring it to be elaborated. She turned to go. "Elira, he said. She stopped. She looked back at him. He was standing at the railing with the mountains behind him and the evening light on his face, and he looked like the thing that he was. A man who had spent 15 years building something on a wrong foundation and had torn it apart rather than let the wrongness continue, and who was still standing, and who was not going to pretend that was nothing. "Thank you," he said, "for not burning it." She knew what he meant. Not the archive, not the fortress. the empire. She had arrived at its gates with 114 people and the full authority of the sovereign blood, active for the first time in 400 years. And she had chosen a legal argument over a military one. And she had chosen it knowing it might not work, knowing the council might not bend, knowing the high lords might not vote correctly, knowing that the machinery of suppression was old and practiced and deeply invested in its own continuation. She had chosen it because the thing she had wanted, underneath the grief and the fury and the 23 days of excavation, was not the Empire's destruction. It was the Empire's truth. Those are different projects. She had known this, she thought, since the moment in the farmhouse kitchen when she had read the bonding law for the third time and understood that a forcing point is not a point of destruction. It is a point of no alternative. The bond had forced the reckoning had forced the acknowledgement had forced the choice. And the choice, the actual choice, the one that mattered, the one that could not be made by bloodline authority or historical claim or the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of suppressed truth, had been made by the people in that room, by 12 council members who could have continued to dig in, by 12 high lords who could have voted differently, by one emperor who had stood at the head of a table with everything he had built at risk and said, "Look at what this is." You cannot force that choice. You can only create the conditions in which it becomes the only honest option. That was what the speaking was. That was what the sovereign blood actually did. Not compel, illuminate. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I know that too," he said. "That's why it means something." She looked at him for one last moment. Then she said, "Build something better with it." She walked back inside. He turned to the mountains. He stood there for a long time, alone on the terrace in the evening light, holding what remained, which was not a dynasty intact, not a philosophy vindicated, not a crown secured, not a bond fulfilled. What remained was the empire, damaged and reckoned with and still standing, full of people who had no idea yet what the next years would require of them, full of work that had no comfortable end, full of the specific difficulty of institutions trying to become more honest than they were built to be. And something else. The quiet, persistent something that the bond had become. Not the original pull of the ceremony hall, not the altered frequency of an awakening power, but the thing that 2 people carry when they have been through fire together and come out the other side not as what they had been, but as what the fire revealed them to be. He could not name it yet. He was not going to try. He looked at the mountains until the light was gone. Then he went inside to do the work. Alara left at dawn. She did not look back at the capital, not from sentiment, not from discipline, but because the direction of her attention had always been forward. And the direction forward was the eastern mountains and the territory that had been waiting 400 years to be rebuilt by someone withstanding to rebuild it. Mira rode beside her. Castor rode behind them. Dort was there, still quiet, still processing, but present in the specific way of a person who has decided that this is where he belongs and has no further questions about it. And ahead of them, in the eastern light of a morning that was cold and clear and indifferent to everything that had happened in the hall behind them, the mountains waited, not with welcome, not with comfort, with the simple, enduring patience of terrain that has outlasted every empire that has ever decided to call itself permanent and will outlast every empire that makes that decision in the future, and has therefore arrived at a kind of equanimity about the business of human ambition that can be mistaken, if you're not careful, for indifference. It is not indifference. It is the long view. The Shadow Empress had not risen because she was chosen. She had risen because she survived being rejected and discovered that the power denied by others had always been hers. That is the difference between authority and legitimacy. Authority is assigned, revoked, managed by the people with the institutional capacity to manage it. Legitimacy is earned in the fire, in the specific, unglamorous, long and difficult fire of living through the thing that was supposed to destroy you and arriving on the other side not softened, but more completely yourself. She had been invisible. She had been rejected. She had walked east into the dark with nothing except grief and a book she couldn't yet read, and the precise, stubborn refusal to be defined by what had been done to her rather than what she chose to do with it. She had read the archive. She had learned the speaking. She had walked back through the gates with 114 witnesses and the documentation of 400 years of suppressed truth, and she had put the truth down in front of the empire and said, "Look at what this is." And it had looked. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The mountains received her as she rode into them, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with only the cold and the light and the particular quality of high altitude that strips everything back to what is actually present and what is actually true. She breathed. She was whole, not healed. Wholeness is not the same as healing, and she was not going to pretend that the scars from the hall and the corridor and the burning archive and 30 days of fire were gone. They were not gone. They were part of the structure now, part of what made the building stand. She was the woman who had survived the rejection. She was the woman who had found the archive. She was the woman who had walked back through the gates. And she was the woman who was riding east into the mountains to build the thing that 400 years of suppression had prevented from being built, with the skills she had always had, and the power she had always carried, and the specific hard-won clarity of someone who has stopped performing survival and started actually living. The road continued east. She rode. And the morning, indifferent and clear, opened ahead of her like a page that had not yet been written, and the writing was hers, all of it. Finally, hers.